research has demonstrated that on an average day in June, the average human brain is capable of remembering at most one thought from a commencement speech. But since today is cooler than average, and West Pointers are definitely above average, I will challenge you to think this morning about two words: surprise and courage. This year marks the 60th anniversary of a military disaster whose name has become synonymous with surprise: the attack on Pearl Harbor. Interestingly, that surprise attack was preceded by an astonishing number of unheeded warnings and missed signals. And at 7 a.m. on December 7th, at Opana Radar Station, two privates detected what they called something completely out of the ordinary. In fact, it was so out of the ordinary that the inexperienced watch officer assumed it must be friendly airplanes and told them just forget about it. Yet military history is full of surprises, even if few are as dramatic or as memorable as Pearl Harbor. Surprise happens so often that it's surprising that we're still surprised by it. Very few of these surprises are the product of simple blindness or simple stupidity. Almost always there have been warnings and signals that have been missed, sometimes because there were just too many warnings to pick the right one out.
California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, and I want to thank our ranking member and my friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, members, I rise today really with a very heavy heart, one that is filled with sorrow for the families and the loved ones who were killed and injured this week.
Only 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, Congress held a vote for a bill titled The Authorization to Use Military Force. This bill was designed as retaliation for the 9/11 attacks that allowed the U.S. not only the power to wage war in Afghanistan, but also endless war in the Middle East, essentially what was labeled the War on Terror.
September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee was the only representative to vote against this legislation.
Now, this resolution will pass, although we all know that the president can wage a war even without it. However difficult this vote may be, some of us must urge the use of restraint. Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute so that this does not spiral out of control. Let us not become the evil that we deplore.
This case probably with Afghanistan, then they have to understand, and others like them around the world have to understand, that if you provide sanctuary to terrorists, you face the full wrath of the United States of America, and that we will, in fact, aggressively go after these nations to make certain that they cease and desist from providing support for these kinds of organizations.
Full wrath. That's a very strong statement to the Afghans this morning.
It is indeed.
The Bush administration's rhetoric in response to 9/11 was frightening, but neoconservatives outside his administration became truly unhinged, showing us what fully spiraling out of control could look like.
On the other hand, I think it's a mistake to focus only on Afghanistan.
The morning after 9/11, neoconservative historian Don Kagan and his military strategist son, Fred Kagan, went on the Milt Rosenberg Extension 720 radio show to discuss their own ideas for what to do in retaliation.
And one key place is certainly the Palestinian Authority.
And we also know, furthermore, where they're located. We know that they have extensive bases in Palestine and Palestinian area. We have to take the war to these people.
We need to take strong military action, including land forces, not only against the Taliban in Afghanistan, but I would suppose at the same time against the Arafat regime in the Palestinian Authority.
Absolutely.
And what else?
It's possible.
What about Iraq next door?
Yeah, it's very possible it would be necessary to do that against Iraq, too.
Prominent neocons inside the administration, like Paul Wolfowitz, also hyped up the possibility of more terrorist attacks.
And Mr. Wolfowitz is the #2 man at the Pentagon. He also served in the Defense Department during the first Bush administration.
I think we have to operate on the assumption that we haven't seen the end of this kind of terrorism.
We know that Iraq encourages them. We know that Iran helps to train them.
May or may not be something that we could justify in our own minds right now. I'm sure in 3-4 days, everybody, in spite of what happened in New York and Washington, everybody will go back to where we were before and think, okay, that was a one-shot, that's over. What would have happened if instead of just having a lot of jet fuel on those planes, they had had anthrax bacilli? Have any clue what that would have been? Now, those are the options that are before us. People are capable of doing that. Our question is, how can we stop them from being able to do that? There is no way.
A mere 3 weeks later, the neocon fantasy came true. The manifestation of what Adam Curtis described as the power of nightmares. A newspaper reporter in Florida named Robert Stevens was infected with anthrax.
Recent weeks have brought a second wave of terrorist attacks upon our country. Deadly anthrax spores sent through the U.S. mail. 4 Americans have died as a result of these acts of terrorism.
It was eventually discovered that weaponized anthrax was sent through the U.S. mail to prominent senators and media figures.
I find it weird that these were received just as the Patriot Act was pending in Congress. There were only 2 men who stood in the way of the Patriot Act passing. It had to get out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was Pat Leahy. He was the chairman of that committee.
Were the letters that were directed to myself, to Senator Daschle.
To the public, the perpetrator appeared to be an Islamic terrorist. The Hart Senate office building was contaminated with airborne anthrax spores and had to be evacuated for over 3 months.
This seems to me like a terrorist attack designed to possibly to change legislation. Had to evacuate their offices and probably just scared the absolute hell out of them. Do you think I'm being paranoid?
Well, I don't think you're being paranoid.
The Patriot Act was fast-tracked during the panic in the legislature. It wasn't hard for Bush or the neocons outside the administration to make the case that terror attacks would continue. But how would we stop them?
Many Americans have started to, what's the word I'm looking for, panic. that chemical and biological weapons can be neutralized by duct tape and plastic sheets.
Many reporters became willing conduits for blatant opportunistic fear-mongering.
Peter, from 3 well-placed but separate sources tonight.
Anonymous government officials fed false reports
on the anthrax sent to Senator Daschle have found a telltale chemical additive
that the anthrax in the letters could be traced back to Saddam Hussein.
It is a trademark of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program.
But perhaps more damaging was the broadcasting of this narrative to the intellectual class. Founders of the neoconservative think tank, the Project for the New American Century, Robert Kagan, William Kristol, and Gary Schmidt, wrote a series of op-eds planting the idea that Iraq was behind the anthrax mailings. Of course, to stop further biological or chemical weapons attacks, they said that we needed to overthrow Saddam Hussein.
And so we're seeing shifting justifications. We just haven't seen the proof of any linkage between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda.
September 11th put it in a different light. We had to take that threat more seriously.
We're saying we're seeing it in the light of September 11th. That's just not true. Yes, you have over and over again through the late 90s urged regime change in Iraq.
Can I try again then, since I believe you're not representing my views properly?
Neocons like Wolfowitz had irreparably damaged their reputation by being a bit too hubristic and candid.
I think that argument that the president lied and the country lied, it's done enormous damage, it continues to do enormous damage, and it is a lie. I don't feel strongly about it, though. I don't want to make too much of yellow cake in Niger. It wasn't the big issue. To me, the big issue was anthrax, frankly.
Some of the actual policy makers behind the Iraq War managed to slip through the cracks and maintain credibility and even influence in Washington, D.C. Clever Iraq War architects, like Robert Kagan, learned early on that they would need to morph and adapt to the level of acceptable dialogue in D.C. to be taken seriously among their peers.
The failure of this war, you could just say, if you feel this way, that it was a terrible error. Not the first, I want to say, in American history, and I dare say not the last.
But perhaps a little backstory about Robert Kagan is needed. Besides being one of the founders of the Project for the New American Century,
I mean, it's not this massive organization. You could have knocked on a door and found the whole Project for the New American Century in one room.
He was also one of the people behind the letter to Clinton advocating for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 1998.
Was that just a long letter?
It was.
In 1998, you as a member of the New American Century sent a letter, and in this letter,
Can I explain? There's
strategy should aim, above all, this is 1998, the strategy should aim, above all, at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. You signed that letter.
Senator, there's a very big difference. I was very clear. I don't know if it's in that letter.
The Project for the New American Century had been associated with the failures of the Iraq War. And just like any ruined brand name, they closed down and reopened under the name the Foreign Policy Initiative.
Foreign policy expert Robert Kagan, an advisor to Reagan and George Bush and others.
But Kagan first gained notoriety in 1994, before founding the Project for the New American Century, by writing the so-called definitive book on Ronald Reagan's foreign policy.
He's written a book on the subject that he was working on in the government. He's written a book on America's involvement in Nicaragua.
So comprehensive in its scope, the reviewers said that it couldn't possibly be biased. Definitely not a rewriting of the historical record. They told us to trust that this account was an objective look at the Reagan administration. Even though 10 years earlier, Kagan served inside the Reagan administration and helped launch sophisticated covert propaganda campaigns to spin the war effort in Nicaragua, the same war his book was largely about. In 1983, as Special Assistant to the Deputy Director of the United States Information Agency, his official job was propagandist under the Reagan administration.
I worked in the U.S. Information Agency, and so that was the official propaganda arm of the United States many years ago.
Kagan developed multifaceted, ingenious strategies to coordinate effective anti-communist guerrilla sentiment in the United States. Using religious groups across the country, sympathetic journalists, and staging media events as an excuse to emphasize Sandinista war crimes.
We can't overstate how much propaganda the U.S. government can do.
During the Iran-Contra hearings, documents revealed Kagan received dirty money funneled inside the U.S. State Department to fund these propaganda campaigns. In 1986, Robert Kagan obtained $25,000 from Oliver North's secret cache of funds to continue the operations of the Contra's political office in Washington. He was serving as Elliott Abrams' special assistant for the State Department's Office of Public Diplomacy. 5 years later, Abrams pled guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges of withholding evidence from Congress in the Iran-Contra scandal before serving any jail time whatsoever. Elliott Abrams was pardoned by George W. Bush Sr. Abrams would later appear as a signatory on several PNAC letters from the 1990s along with Wolfowitz and his former subordinate Robert Kagan. Each one of these men got their start as aggressive and paranoid Cold Warriors in the 1980s under Reagan. Kagan made efforts to continue this Cold War mindset in Washington, D.C., even after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Everybody thinks that there should have been a peace dividend from the war, from the end of the Cold War. Think about the consequences of this drawdown.
Kagan remained a fixture in D.C. foreign policy culture.
Robert Kagan, very smart people.
Robert Kagan argued in a pretty incredible article here.
Scholar known to many of you here, Robert Kagan has reported.
But as Robert Kagan argues in The World America Made...
Robert Kagan, David Petraeus, look at each of them, how their ideas influenced America's sense of itself.
He became so influential that he later went on to advise John McCain, Mitt Romney, Hillary Clinton, and even Barack Obama.
Kagan was recently described as President Obama's favorite Romney advisor.
Thank you, Charlie.
So did you have any communication with the president over any of his staff?
I talked to the White House staff now and then about various foreign policy issues.
The president had been influenced by your views.
So I hear. I mean, I'm very pleased that the president found what I was writing interesting and useful.
You're not giving credit to Obama for anything, are you?
I do give credit to Obama. I give him credit for that.
How can you advise Romney and like anything Obama did?
When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she appointed Robert Kagan on her Foreign Policy Advisory Board.
Mr. Kagan serves on the Foreign Policy Advisory Board of Hillary Clinton. What's that all about?
Well, Secretary Clinton has set up this Foreign Affairs Policy Board, it's called, and it's a bipartisan group. I think it's modeled after what they've had at the Pentagon for many years.
John Kerry eventually replaced Hillary Clinton, yet Robert Kagan still remained on her Foreign Policy Advisory Board. During Obama's second term, Robert Kagan and other neocons tried to sell the idea that Putin's Russia was now the biggest threat America faced.
And we need to not worry that the problem is our encirclement rather than Russian ambition.
These are the leaders of the American War Party, the people who literally want a military showdown with Russia.
This is a how does it work question. You're married to Victoria Nuland.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, who is now Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, was perfectly positioned to insert her husband's policies regarding Ukraine, where a confrontation between the United States and Russia was now brewing.
Designed to say to Russia, this is NATO territory, this is Article 5 territory, we will defend every inch, don't mess with it.
And since Mr. Putin was caught off balance by Yanukovych, then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine.
Isn't this, by definition, the Cold War arms buildup close to
how this feels as if it's close to the Cold War. Are we on the verge of a new Cold War with Ukraine as the main battlefield?
Regardless of this strange, cozy relationship with one of DC's most notorious neoconservatives and the Obama White House and State Department, Kagan decided to start aggressively campaigning against Obama's foreign policy in the press. Apparently, Nuland helped her husband craft these attacks on Obama's foreign policy. Kagan argued that Obama had made the world a more dangerous place by backing down in Syria and acquiescing to Putin in Ukraine. The solution, he said, was that we should posture aggressively towards Russia and be willing to use the full range of our military capabilities, including ground troops, to maintain what Kagan called the world order.
Instability in Ukraine, conflict seems to have even escalated in the last few weeks.
I think that's entirely fair.
Bob Kagan, you're our next opening statement. Please proceed, sir.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for being out here to listen to a debate about foreign policy. Is the world more dangerous, and does Barack Obama have anything to do with it? I think the world clearly is more dangerous. You know, Fareed, who has written some brilliant articles over the years, and a few months ago he talked about statistics that Steven Pinker, the evolutionary psychologist at Harvard, came up with, noting that violence had declined. Pinker's answer is people have just gotten nicer. I have a different answer. Pinker's study begins in 1945. Violence had declined from 1945 steadily over the decades. Why is that? What happened in 1945? Well, what happened in 1945 is that on the ruins of the greatest world catastrophe that we'd ever known, World War II, after a period of global disorder, the democratic nations, the United States, achieved three extraordinary things. One, an enormous spread of democracy. Another, an enormous increase in global prosperity, the likes of which we'd never seen before. And finally, an end to great power conflict of the kind that we saw in the first part of the 20th century.
They said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that could turn the smoking gun into a mushroom cloud, and they were wrong. They said Iraq had ties to Al-Qaeda, and they were wrong. They said the war would be a cakewalk, and they were wrong. Over and again, they were wrong. Among the most celebrated of these hawks is Robert Kagan, senior fellow with the Brookings Institution, a darling of the neocons. Yet, 11 years, thousands of lives, millions of refugees, and trillions of dollars later,
War architects like Robert Kagan are getting quoted in the New York Times again.
Writing in Politico magazine recently, Robert Kagan is with the Brookings Institution. He's not a neoconservative.
In 2002, he and William Crystal wrote that for the war on terrorism to succeed, Saddam Hussein must be removed. When George W. Bush set out to do just that, Kagan cheered him on, and then in 2006, called for a surge in American troop levels to prevent Iraq's collapse.
Fred Kagan is my younger, smarter brother. He's the sort of formulator of the idea of how you would do a surge in Iraq right now. He's a military historian. If the world is more dangerous, it is because that is what is at risk today. Now, I don't know what the future holds, and maybe things will even out, but I see areas of reason for concern that this world order is at risk.
Now, Robert Kagan is stirring controversy again with this lengthy article in the New Republic. Superpowers don't get to retire what our tired country still owes the world. He calls for America to return to muscular global activism.
One element is we see that the number of democracies around the world has been declining steadily. In Europe, since 1945, we see cross-border aggression by one nation for the purpose of changing borders, something that we thought we'd eradicated in Europe.
This critique of Kagan, titled The Duplicity of the Ideologues. Andrew Bacevich, welcome back.
Thank you.
So what do you mean, the duplicity of ideologues?
Well, Kagan's essay, which does deserve to be read simply because of Kagan's stature in Washington, gives us a falsified, sanitized, and in some respects, illusory account of recent American history.
How so?
Now, is all of this Barack Obama's fault? Of course not. Has Barack Obama's policies made these things, this situation, worse? Of course they have. Of course they have.
Well, his notion of American history, particularly since 1945, is one that we might term an extended liberation narrative, where the United States devoted itself in the wake of World War II to promoting liberal values, democracy everywhere, fighting against evildoers, and he concludes that this success is being squandered by Barack Obama and those who are unwilling to continue this crusade. Now, that narrative is only sustainable if you leave a lot of important facts out, or if you distort those facts. So we get no mention of overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. And perhaps most egregiously, he utterly ignores the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which he served as a cheerleader for, and which, to a very large extent, account for the problem that we're dealing with today in the greater Middle East.
Somehow, Kagan had been extremely effective in omitting his own role in the Iraq War from the historical record.
We know how ISIS got to be what it is today. It was because the United States withdrew prematurely a limited number of troops from Iraq.
Do you know the president? Have you met him?
I have. I've been in 2 or 3 meetings with him. And
how do you size him up close?
Because the president did not listen to Anne-Marie, who repeatedly said that if we can support a moderate opposition in Syria, we may be able to avoid having the vacuum filled by jihadists. Well, he's what you hear. He's a thoughtful guy. He clearly listens. He has his own ideas. Well, lo and behold, it has been filled by jihadists. Iraq has begun to fall apart. Are we supposed to say that Barack Obama had nothing to do with any of this? That he's a Caribbean island sitting here watching the hurricane go by? American presidents are not all powerful, but they are not bereft of all power either. I would say of the presidents I've met, there's a more ordinary guy quality to him, less of a kind of presidential aura than you might expect when you're in his presence.
Very little effort to look beyond the Bush versus Obama, Republican versus Democrat, to try to understand the larger forces in play that have brought us to where we are today.
Japan is wondering whether Barack Obama can be trusted. His unwillingness to use force in Syria after he said that he was going to use force did echo around the world, raise doubts among our allies about whether we could be relied upon. More to come.
Well done, Bob.
What are those larger forces at work?
And this present order has been shaped very much in conformity with American preferences. So somebody's going to be imposing some kind of order.
Because Robert Kagan says, quote, world order shows signs of cracking and perhaps even collapsing.
It's really unique. And I also think that it's very fragile.
And that these changes signal a transition into a different world order, which the United States should attempt to lead.
I think the order is something that is both unprecedented in history. We've really never had a time like this for all the terrible things that are still going on in the world by comparison. What I'm really responding to is this notion that there is that there could ever be an order that everyone has agreed to.
When Kagan uses phrases like world order, he's describing something that never really existed except in his own imagination.
The solution to the crisis in Ukraine lies in part in Syria. It is time for U.S. President Barack Obama to demonstrate that he can order the offensive use of force. Close your ears, Fareed. Please close your ears. This is another intervention. The offensive use of force in circumstances other than secret drone attacks or covert operations. The result will change the strategic calculus not only in Damascus, but also in Moscow.
Kagan believes, many people in Washington believe, perhaps too many people in the hinterland also believe, that the United States shapes the global order, that there is an order for which we alone are responsible. Where does this kind of thinking come from?
I think we're going to be talking primarily about policy options. I thought we'd start by at least delving into what is the state of play, as we like to say.
What we see here is the contemporary expression of the whole notion of American exceptionalism.
Well, Americans always spend a lot of time talking about how we're the greatest country in the world. It's very annoying to a lot of other people around the world, although there's a lot of agreement, I would say, if you really probe. But I think it is.
When Robert Kagan said that he considers Hillary Clinton a fellow neoconservative, that's exactly what he was referring to. I think she kind of pulled forward with this kind of hubristic notion that kind of America could heal the world through its touch and its good intentions.
So the only question is, what kind of imposition is it going to be? And I would prefer this particular imposition, which, by the way, as impositions go, it's a pretty light kind of imposition. I mean,
that we are chosen, we are called upon by God, called upon by Providence to somehow transform the world and remake it in our own image.
But everything bad that has happened in American foreign policy has sprung directly from that idea.
it's those who are not happy with the order who feel imposed on, and I understand why they do. But somebody's going to be imposed on.
Now, Robert Kagan wouldn't state it as bluntly as I just did.
We set up an international legal order more or less after World War II and then proceeded to violate it on and off again for the next 70 years.
But that is the kind of thinking that I think makes it very difficult for us to have a genuine and serious foreign policy debate.
Putin went into Crimea because of what happened to Yanukovych in Ukraine. The question is, what about since then? How do you deter Putin from going further than he'd already gone? Fareed is talking about all the incredible suffering that the Russian economy is going through, and certainly it is. The only problem is, every day Putin continues to pour weapons into Ukraine, continues to pour troops into Ukraine in violation of his own agreements, and the West's only response is possibly we'll think about more sanctions in a few weeks. We couldn't be bothered to provide the Ukrainians with some capacity to defend themselves, some weaponry, some training. That is the least that we ought to be able to do.
Thank you, guys. That's terrific. Really, really strong. Really strong, Bob. You're great.
I didn't realize that's all these projects.
Get one in there. Okay. I'll squeeze it back. You can stay right there.
Oh, there you go.
The Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, said last week that the West and Russia have, quote, slid into a time of a new Cold War. Ukraine, your country, isn't just in the middle of that Cold War. It's one of the main battlegrounds for that new Cold War. It's one of the causes, some might say, of that new Cold War.
It's right.
Do you foresee a day where there's actual military confrontation between the West and Russia?
I hope not. I hope not.
Most dangerous close passes in decades, one of the most between U.S. and Russian warplanes. This took place on a routine mission intercepted by a single Russian Su-27 flanker aircraft, crossed the nose of the U.S. aircraft within just 100 feet.
Was this incident directly related to the crisis in Ukraine? Has there been an uptick?
The latest incidents in a string of recent aerial encounters over the Pacific.
More than 100 around Europe, the most flights since the Cold War.
So a very stark, as I say, warning there from the Russian president.
The Air Force general sounding a warning about Russian military maneuvers.
He says Russia is ramping up its air activity over the Pacific Ocean.
We will judge Russia by its actions, not its words.
The last thing you want is to actually have some 19-year-old Russian fighter pilots shoot down an American jet or something, you know.
Secretary of State for European Affairs Victoria Nuland told a congressional hearing on foreign affairs that she considered Russia's actions in Ukraine an invasion and that fresh fighting over recent days was very concerning.
Moscow's message to Europe and the U.S. We're back, and we can pierce your defenses.
Defending against Vladimir Putin's Russian military aggression is about to get harder.
CNN took the lead in broadcasting content that was a more expensive, modernized form of 1960s TV news Cold War propaganda. But this time Khrushchev was Putin.
A new generation of Russian cruise missiles could strike critical military radars and missiles inside the United States.
Further sanctions pressure should Russia continue fueling the fire in the east of Ukraine or in other parts of the country.
Nuland said that Moscow had deployed hundreds of pieces of military equipment, including tanks, rocket systems and heavy artillery, along with, quote, thousands and thousands of soldiers. She added that Russia was funding, fueling, commanding and controlling the war. On Tuesday, European and US leaders, including President Barack Obama, said the international community must respond to any major violation of the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine as they sought to further pressure the Kremlin over the conflict.
The development of the cruise missiles that they have that have a very long range, that from eastern Russia, they can range critical infrastructure in Alaska and in Canada.
This is the missile now in the final stages of Russian development. Its 2,000-mile-plus range gives the Russians the ability to fire from near their own coastline.
I hope everyone understands that it's better not to mess with Russia. I have to remind you that Russia is a nuclear superpower.
US lawmakers challenged Nuland to explain why the White House had withheld from providing more military support to Ukrainian forces.
Policy like this should not be partisan. We're rising today as Democrats and Republicans, really as Americans, to say enough is enough in Ukraine.
The Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment, which analyzes the way foreign leaders move.
Russia's provocations are only more worrisome in light of Vladimir Putin's intense focus.
The Russian president carries a neurological abnormality, Asperger's syndrome.
The top U.S. commander in Europe even raising nuclear weapons concerns.
There are those dual-use weapon systems that could very easily be nuclear or non-nuclear.
Supported at the reptilian stage of development where the need for order precedes all interaction. His primary coping strategy is to control.
Russia has become a clear threat to a half-century of American commitment to an investment in a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace.
It's the ranking member, Eliot Engel of New York's leadership in support of the people of Ukraine.
What Putin is doing is he's changing borders by force since on the continent of Europe for the first time since World War II.
While people have sort of been assuming that, oh, the neocons are dead, they've gone away, they've been shamed, their rhetoric doesn't work anymore.
They are only asking for the weapons they need. This unprovoked attack will undermine the foundation of the international order.
I think what's scary about it is that the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is literally Project for the New American Century rebranded, has crept up in the background and nobody's paying attention.
This is a manufactured conflict controlled by the Kremlin, fueled by Russian tanks and heavy weapons.
It's highly precise, flies low, and is difficult to detect.
If we don't have the ability to detect it, we can't defend against it.
The administration's response to this crisis has been tepid at best. I ask our colleagues to vote for this bipartisan resolution, urging the administration to provide this critical assistance to Ukraine before it is too late.
When you start playing these games, there's always the risk of someone going too far and provoking at a level you didn't intend.
That's all I have to say about my bill.
The first job of the president is to protect America. Our next president must be prepared to lead. I know Jeb. I know his good heart and his strong backbone. Jeb will unite our country. He knows how to bring the world together against terror, and he knows when tough measures must be taken. Experience and judgment count in the Oval Office. Jeb Bush is a leader. who will keep our country safe.
Cat. Hello, Captain.
Yeah, Cat, look at it.
How are you?
You're looking great.
Jeb Bush was one of the top signers of the Project for the New American Century.
Right. Jeb Bush. Right to Rise USA is responsible for the content of this message.
We are simply being asked to give the Ukrainians the methods to defend themselves, the weapons to defend themselves. I can't think of anything more reasonable.
We can give Ukraine money, we can give them weapons, or we can give them weapons. If they had money, they could buy weapons.
The new Ukrainian government that the U.S. helped install was coming apart at the seams.
A member opposing each will be controlling 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you.
Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment that I propose this evening limits arms training and other assistance to the neo-Nazi Ukrainian militia, the Azov Battalion.
There were pictures that we were told, were neo-Nazis. The question is, were there neo-Nazi groups involved in that?
There were, as I said, almost every color of Ukraine was represented, including some ugly colors.
The answer is yes, then.
Nazis fighting, it's not true. It's everything is propaganda war.
U.S. newspapers, not just Russian newspapers, have documented the Azov Battalion and other such groups fighting on the front lines against Russia.
Foreign Policy magazine has characterized the 1,000-man Azov Battalion as, quote, openly neo-Nazi and, quote, fascist.
Who have swastikas on their trucks. It's not true at all?
I doesn't see swastika.
U.S. Representative John Conyers was able to attach an amendment to a bill to fund the Ukrainian army, blocking money to the Azov Battalion.
The Azov Battalion will be among the units to receive training and arms from Western allies, including the United States. These groups run counter to American values. I urge support of our amendment and make it a U.S. law that we will not equip this dangerous neo-Nazi militia.
The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment is adopted.
The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross Laitner, to suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 162.
House Resolution 162, resolution calling on the President to provide Ukraine with military assistance to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
A 5-minute vote on House Resolution 162, military assistance for Ukraine.
Как тактическая ручка. Одной руки, работала с другой руки. Рука твердая, танки наши быстро. А вот были какие деньги, вот это были вещи. Новый терминал! Фоя!
This is a resolution from Eliot Engel, the top Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, urging the president to provide military weaponry to Ukraine as it fights Russian-backed separatists. Again, a 5-minute vote. Senator Ted Cruz was the first to throw his hat into the 2016 Republican presidential candidate ring. While the vote is underway, we'll show you his remarks from earlier today.
Thank you so much, President Falwell. God bless Liberty University. I am thrilled to join you today at the largest Christian university in the world. Today, I want to talk with you about the promise of America.
I'm getting ready to do something too. I'm running for president, but the deck is still stacked in favor of those at the top, and I want to be that champion.
Mr. Kagan serves on the Foreign Policy Advisory Board of Hillary Clinton.
That is why I am running for president of the United States.
So we can make America greater than it's ever been, and make of this century a new American century. Thank you, sir.
I am proud to announce my candidacy for President of the United States of America.
To rescue a great country now adrift, join me as together we seek a new vision for America. I am putting myself forward as a candidate for President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second.
Cowardice. Are you serious? Apologies for freedom. I can't handle this. When freedom rings, answer the call. On your feet, stand up tall. Freedom's on our shoulders. USA! Enemies of freedom. Face the music. Come on, boys, take them down. President Donald Trump knows how to make America great. Deal from strength or get crushed every time.
A package of non-lethal aid for Ukraine to defend the country against Russian-backed militants.
Game, set, and match in the Ukraine. The only way the United States can have any effect in this region and turn the tide is to start killing Russians. Killing Russians by killing so many Russians that Russians are returning to the motherland in body bags.
Leading from behind, I believe it's called, General.
I believe so, Lou. That's right.
Our banner mistakenly said Obama considers arming pro-U.S. troops. Well, this is actually about whether the United States and other NATO countries should send arms to the Ukrainian military. Certainly not pro-U.S. troops. I regret that error.
300 American military trainers have arrived in Ukraine, prompting an angry response from the Kremlin.
Standing with the U.S. ambassador, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said Britain, Canada, and Poland will also help with the training, which he said represents a new dimension in Ukraine's cooperation with its Western supporters.
I think it sends a strong message to anyone that the U.S. supports the independence and integrity of Ukraine.
The symbolism of this training is not lost on anyone.
Fighting the threat of a Russian invasion in the Baltics Around 400 US armoured vehicles were unloaded into Riga harbour on Monday as part of NATO's response to the Kremlin's actions in Ukraine.
We are here to partner, to train, to show our resolve, and on short notice to launch US forces and cargo to demonstrate our reach, our agility, and our expeditionary capabilities.
What we're trying to do is advance the same policy that we've had for 25 years, which is it's in our interest, it's in the rest of Europe's interest to have a Europe that's increasingly whole, free, and at peace. And these moves made by the Kremlin undercut and threaten this compact that we've had for all of these years.
We can deliver combat power for our allies anytime, anywhere needed.
When you're training these men here in Lithuania, so close to Russia, what do you think you're actually training them for?
I'm training my soldiers to learn how to fight as a platoon in the company, sir.
They established a rapid response force of 5,000 soldiers, along with a separate small unit of officers from the 3 Baltic states.
The U.S. Army Europe can and will provide prompt support as needed from the air, from the sea, and from the land.
The armoured vehicles formed the first batch of some 230 delivered as part of Washington's multi-million-dollar package of non-lethal aid for Ukraine to defend the country against Russian-backed militants.
The yeas are 348 and the nays are 48. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Gavel.
A Ukrainian militia fighting against pro-Russia separatists. The Guardian reports them as being fearless in battle. The group dons Nazi symbols. They are also gaining momentum politically, winning 10% of the vote in municipal elections last October. The ban was passed by Congress in July after Congressman John Conyers of Michigan and Ted Yoho of Florida added an amendment to a bill.
After the bill was passed through the House and Senate, with the Conyers amendment blocking funding to the neo-Nazi group,
The Pentagon convinced the House Defense Appropriations Committee to remove it.
The Pentagon behind closed doors overrode the amendment and allowed funding to continue to the Azov Battalion.
The news has angered some Jewish groups, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
Listen to what Amnesty International said last year. Ukrainian police were involved in torture. Pro-Kiev forces were involved in abductions. Is this the new Ukraine you're trying to build, where all these human rights violations are happening?
I'm sorry. I have just personally seen, having been behind the wheel of the Humvee.
For now, Obama was only allowing piecemeal amounts of U.S. military equipment, like Humvees, to be sent to Ukraine.
Today, Ukraine is central to our 25-year effort for a Europe whole, free, and at peace.
Victoria Nuland looked exhausted and frustrated when having to explain the delay in sending the funds that Congress had already approved twice before.
Many members of our committee will continue to hammer the Obama administration on this damaging and unnecessary and senseless delay in providing the lethal aid that Ukraine so desperately needs.
The Senate and House of Representatives unanimously passed legislation in December that authorizes sending arms to Kiev. Obama signed the measure into law, but it gave him leeway over whether or when to send the arms.
Even though Obama signed the bill into law, he repeatedly put off actually sending offensive weapons to the Ukrainian army. Was it possible that Obama had finally started to reverse the flow of neoconservative influence in his administration?
The problem with the Obama administration is that it's too weak abroad, and that is very dangerous.
But was it too late to make a difference?
What do you say about amnesties?
We defend our country.
What about the torture, the abductions, the not protecting civilians, placing troops?
Please,
Amnesty be Human Rights Watch?
I don't know what from you take this information.
Amnesty International. You've heard of Amnesty International?
I'm sorry.
Good old Johnny Boy has already called for a bill that would require the U.S. to send weapons to arm the Ukrainian government, regardless of the administration's policy decision.
Thank you very, very much. Very, very generous comments.
Oh, great. A proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. What could possibly go wrong?
Yes, the White House is aware of the incident that you described. In the Baltic Sea earlier this week, there were reports of Russian planes flying dangerously close to a U.S. naval ship. And we continue to be concerned about this behavior.
We actually go back to... Hold on a minute. Sir, can somebody help me?
Hi, I'm Bill Maher, and I'm here with the badass correspondents from Vice, Shane Smith. They are badasses.
I'm kind of like the hillbilly who's kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies. I'm just wide-eyed going, really? You want to give me money? Ding, 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 you know, like.
John, he's pretty confident. He's about to build $1 billion business.
You're laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, I just laughed, so I guess Look, we're doing well.
Started as a magazine, but has really become influential in the world of online video. They really get a lot of viewers that are younger, the types that traditional news outlets would be very interested.
We know how to speak to young people. They're listening to us. We're a trusted brand for them.
Vice was quickly becoming one of the most influential news channels in the United States.
Vice is a network of channels, each geared to the passions of young people today.
You've also said you want to be the Time Warner of the street. We already are the Time Warner of the street.
And now they're launching Vice News to sort of get into the game of shorter form content.
Vice News is a first-person account of our changing world in a language that young people understand and trust.
You're close to generating $1 billion in revenue, or?
That's the plan, yeah.
Within the next, what?
12 to 18 months.
And welcome to the business of life. A fresh perspective on the most important issues of our time, as told through the facts, figures, dollars and cents.
But the network started to put out strange content, like a Bank of America infomercial posing as a hip talk show.
Of life.
Perhaps it was after acquiring their new investors, like Disney and right-wing media mogul Rupert Murdoch, they decided to take a little bit more of a corporate approach.
Fox is fantastic for Vice. Why? Because we can go after them.
If you look at the investors that they've got, Trish, some influential ones. Rupert Murdoch is a fan. 21st Century Fox, his company, owns about 5%. Smith says that that Fox investment, which at the time valued the company at around $1.5 billion, gave them some wiggle room.
But what kind of news content were they actually putting out to reach young people?
We're actually going to put on a little video just to let you guys know what's going on with Vice in case you're not familiar. So enjoy that.
Vice was originally a hipster fashion magazine from Montreal, founded by Shane Smith and Gavin McGinnis.
I'm Shane Smith.
I'm Gavin McGinnis. We're Vice Magazine.
Well, Gavin Sarouche and I have always been insanely close.
I've known Shane since I was 12. Told me about girls and where the G-spot is and everything.
And my brother at this time was like the sexual mechanic. Am I like the worst?
It was easy to see how obnoxious and off-putting the founders of Vice were. But not as easy to gauge what their political outlook was and how that would shape the future of their news channel.
Most of the attitude of Vice really is this irreverent stupidity.
That was until Vice started to become an influential voice in international news and foreign policy.
It sounds goofy, but when you're 28, it's hard to think like a 16-year-old irreverent retard.
These fucking kids dancing on the subway for money.
The youth of North America know Vice. Vice is a household name to them. Everybody else doesn't know us, which is great. We love it that way.
They're swinging around a pole on the train, and you go, that's a stripper pole, faggot. You're a loser.
But you realize you can't spend 24 hours a day, you know, together with someone, or it's going to destroy not only the friendship, but the company and everything. And now, in fact, we're better friends because of it.
What What is the beef with Vice? You guys started together. 'Cause Shane Smith's a good friend of mine. He's not a friend of mine, but you grew up together.
Yeah.
When did it go wrong?
06.
What happened?
I think it was, I mean, I legally can't talk about it because I sold my shares, so I did a non-disclosure, non-disparagement thing.
Get paid.
I got fucking incredibly paid.
This could be the savior of humanity, but ironically, it was built to destroy us.
The White House chief of staff under Obama, Alyssa Mastromonaco, became Vice's COO. In an unprecedented move, which Vice described as historic, teamed up with President Obama to visit a U.S. jail. Not many people criticized Vice for this move, since it brought to light important issues about the U.S. prison system. But what would people have said if Fox News did something like this, letting Bush host his own show? Vice's Russian Roulette was a series of on-the-ground reports from the battlefront of Ukraine. The program, while edgy and bare-knuckled, very narrowly echoed the U.S. State Department position in Ukraine. For over 100 episodes, they never once mentioned how the U.S. spent over $5 billion to assist the Ukrainian uprising or helped install the new Ukrainian government.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience.
What do you think is the most fascinating thing about Ukraine?
What I think the most fascinating thing about what's happening in the Ukraine is when you go to Russia, I'm always shocked at the anti-American, anti-Western rhetoric that is almost Cold War level.
Fuck Putin! Fuck Putin!
And when we met with Vice President Joe Biden here at the Vice headquarters in New York City, he warned us that Putin's government is using its control over Russian language media to mislead the public. You're Nazi Germany. This week on Vice, America's new Cold War with Russia. Is the Cold War indeed happening with Russia again? The Kremlin. So we're here in the Kremlin. We're going to talk to people in the propaganda industry here on the ground in Russia.
It wasn't until over dozens of hours of content and 2 years into the Ukraine crisis that Vice explained part of the history of NATO's expansion in their Cold War 2.0 special.
So you believe that NATO is moving aggressively towards Russia, and then Russia then has to defend itself.
Yet they still managed to portray the Russian government as foolish and paranoid for being concerned about NATO expansion. Vice even brought on a pseudoscientist from the Eurasianist foreign policy U.S. think tank, the Atlantic Council, to help shape the story of an episode.
Higgins is currently working with an American think tank called the Atlantic Council to produce a report that shows that anyone with an internet connection can prove for themselves that Russia has fought in Ukraine.
Rather than relying on propaganda.
I asked him to help me find Russian troops in Ukraine.
А вы какое средство массовой информации?
Мы HBO называем.
Сейчас все западные журналисты, в моем понимании, педерасты, блин. Все, завязывайте.
By the way, it doesn't bode well for what's going to happen in the Ukraine.
Actually, it's a good example. You see that in the way they're covering what's happening in the Ukraine today.
Correct. Yes.
You wouldn't recognize what we are hearing in Russia from what they're saying.
Fuck Putin! Fuck Putin!
Kerry coming over seems to be an act of aggression. Meanwhile, they have troops going in with their insignia ripped off.
We just did an experiment in Southeastern Europe where we started with a block of programming and ended up being a free-to-air network.
Continue. Continue.
I'm just saying that I'm not a journalist.
But if you succeed, at some point, you're not the underdog anymore.
Correct.
So what happens then?
Then somebody comes after me.
Okay.
That's how it works. But I'll be dead by then, or...
Young people today developed the most sophisticated bullshit detectors of all time. And the only way to circumvent that bullshit detector is to not bullshit.
And when you go to North Korea, you see, the cult of personality, that utopian sort of, socialist, or communist system. It's incredibly important because you realize that if propaganda is journalism, if journalism is taken over by the state, then we all run the risk of that happening. And that's what's terrifying.
Perhaps Shane Smith thought only state-funded media manipulation was inherently bad, which might have explained the Vice special where they let oligarch George Soros, widely known to have helped fund the Ukrainian uprising with his vast fortune.
Hello, I'm George Soros.
Read one of his essays on why the US and Europe should wake up and help the Ukrainian army in a fight against Russia.
Recapture the original idea that led to the formation of the European Union. By saving Ukraine, the European Union would be also saving itself.
Vice made a point to emphasize when any media outlet they cited or mentioned was Korean state-funded or Russian state-funded. But oddly, whenever they used content from or cited a US government-funded media outlet, they didn't care to mention it. Even though most of the public was unaware that outlets like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America were US state-funded propaganda outlets. A Broadcasting Board of Governors executive once described them as soft foreign policy instruments of the United States. In fact, the BBG, the body that oversaw America's state-funded media content, was so proud at how often Vice Media used their material that they listed it at the top of their weekly auditing reports. Was Vice, for all its hipster trappings, actually being more truthful than any of the other Rupert Murdoch properties? A lot of the outlet's editorial slant wasn't very adversarial towards the US government narrative, and Vice seemed to think that their audience didn't need to know that source material in their articles was actually US state-funded content. Only 1 out of 35 articles that we looked through during the making of this film could we find a citation explaining that RFE-RL was a US state-funded apparatus in an article by Samuel Oakford about drug use in Afghanistan.
Like I say, we won't be the next CNN. We'll be 10 times that size.
Okay, well, good luck trying to become Rupert Murdoch.
So did the young faces at Vice really have no political ideology? Vice's first talk show was hosted by Republican pundit Reihan Salam.
I'm Reihan Salam,
who once said that he couldn't decide on if he supported torture or not.
I'm not the only person who just feels, frankly, very confused and torn and finds it very difficult to talk about the issue regarding the utility of enhanced interrogation.
Fareed Zakaria, who initially was a supporter of the Iraq War, was now a producer on Vice News while still working for CNN, alongside of Bill Maher, who helped launch the program and fund it on HBO.
I was a fan of the magazine, and I got involved because it made sense to get involved.
Bill Maher's obsession with Islam was on full display. Maher was determined to preach to his television audience about what he thought were the evils of Islam and the barbaric people of the Middle East.
Absolutely, because they're violent, because they threaten us, and they are threatening. They bring that desert stuff to our world. We don't threaten each other, we sue each other. That's the sign of civilized people, and they don't.
Islam is a religion of peace. Do you buy that?
Yeah, they blow you up. There's a PC over there, there's a PC over there, there's a PC over there. The kids read just one book. They're memorizing the Quran. That's all they do. You know, that's not what we do in this country.
There's only one faith that kills you or wants to kill you if you renounce the faith.
I'm the liberal in this debate.
I'm very worried that you have a national audience where we're promoting Islamic hatred.
We're not, no, you're wrong about that.
But how much of this hostility towards Muslims rubbed off on Vice's own programming?
We have been sold this meme of Islamophobia.
You're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing. That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Well, no,
It really isn't.
I'm not denying that certain.
But why are you so hostile about
Because
this
it's
concept?
gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so not.
It's like saying
It's
those
so not. You're
stateless, shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what.
But Islam
But
at
why
this moment
when
is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's just
ideas
a fact.
like
There is a problem with Islamophobia in this country, and it's Islamophobia.
Even though Gavin McInnes left Vice almost a decade earlier, by his own admission until 2006, he was wholly responsible for the vision of the magazine's content.
All religions are the same.
Well, I think
except for Muslim religions, because they have such a severe problem with inbreeding that they've gone backwards in time.
a lot of that has to do with all sorts of fucked up shit that's going on in the Middle East.
Marrying your
has to do
first
with-
cousin is what it has to do with.
Were we seeing some of the roots of the actual Vice ethos?
The RNC, Dick Cheney, Paul Ryan, all of them.
They're all wimps. We need intolerance.
Great stuff. Very enlightening. Thank you, guys. And here's what you're going to see on the next episode of Vice.
Hello.
Hi. How do you guys get recruited to go to fight in Syria and Iraq?
No one recruited me. Actually, no one spoke a single word to me.
Are you fighting right now?
Inshallah, we'll make some attacks in New York soon. Bid'Allah ta'ala. A lot of brothers there mobilizing right now.
Vice achieved what Fox News terrorism fear-mongering could never achieve: fear of Islamic terrorism among young American liberals.
You know, as far as the weapons of mass destruction, it's a puzzle that no one has a good answer to. I think, you know, trying to get into the head of Saddam Hussein is going to take a lot of time.
The very same armchair warriors in Washington who from the safety of their Beltway bunkers called for invading Baghdad are demanding once again that America plunge into the sectarian wars of the Middle East.
There really are substantial American interests at stake in what's going on in the Middle East, and particularly in Syria.
The neocons and war makers in the United States had a perfect situation fall into their lap. No longer did they need to blatantly exaggerate the threat of Islamic terrorism. ISIS itself was constantly upping the ante in videos and messages, grabbing headlines weekly in Western media.
Well, let's talk about one of those foreign policy headaches, ISIS.
Area in Iraq and Syria that ISIS is trying to take over and build some version of a caliphate, to borrow their words. It's strategically valuable territory.
And I worry that as we have in the past, as we did in the 1920s and 30s, we want to try to look away from a dangerous world. Eventually it comes back to bite us.
So we've got to do more, I believe, than just simply say we're going in to protect American civilians, which we're doing, and American troops, which we should be doing.
Parts of Iraq, fertile hunting ground, so to speak, for the terrorist group ISIS.
This is a serious threat. ISIS is one of the most evil organizations that has ever existed in the world. The reality is ISIS poses a clear and present danger to the United States homeland and has an ability to conduct operational military planning and execute it that is in advance of anything that I've seen.
There was no evidence whatsoever that ISIS was advanced or capable enough to conduct an attack on United States soil, but it was clear that they were advanced enough to learn from American films, video games, and our violence-obsessed media culture.
This is a group of unfathomable evil. We really have to reckon with that.
A headline at the website Think Progress sums it up. The people who broke Iraq have a lot of ideas about fixing it now.
This is unacceptable from a moral perspective and from a U.S. national security perspective.
What ISIS is doing is a whole other, they are literally, like I said, trying to wipe out borders and trying to build a real caliphate, build their own governing space. So we should be very concerned about the implications for the homeland.
The FBI neocons once again rode the wave and jumped in during this opportunity to push the envelope.
A chorus of kindred voices fills the echo chamber. The same old faces, the same old arguments.
Whose career was hurt by pushing us into the Iraq War? They're all around here. They're all still telling us what we should do.
Given your track record, why should we get behind you in supporting a third war in the Middle East? You've called for military action.
Bill Kristol, I mean, he would be another example of someone who's failed upwards. I mean, he's been wrong about so many public policy issues. The Iraq War.
Some of us have actually tried to learn from these disastrous experiences of the last decade.
And yet he continues to be promoted and get gigs and be on the air. And this is not about any particular network, all of them.
Bill Kristol on ABC.
This president pulled out of Iraq in 2011. He let the Syrian civil war explode, and now we have a terrible situation.
What we have done to that country is a crime.
We have done to that country what we did to that country.
Sitting next to Bill Kristol, man. I mean, the architects of a catastrophe that have cost this country trillions of dollars, thousands of lives. There should be accountability. This country should not go back to war. We don't need armchair warriors. And if you feel so strongly, you should, with all due respect, enlist in the Iraqi army.
That's a very cute line, Katrina.
No, but it's real.
My solution is to be serious about being engaged in the Middle East, but not to pull out 100% of Iraq and then leave them to go back to the same cycle that led to 9/11.
Perpetual war. If we don't set ISIS back, we're going to have this huge ungovernable space, basically in the hands of radical Islamic extremists.
Perpetual engagement and being serious about our responsibilities as a world power. Are you against that? Are you against that? Authorizing the use of force, and I think you would have huge majorities in Congress. They're all for it.
It seems to me there is none, less than zero appetite for the kind of thing you're talking about. They're all for it.
I mean, 80% of them are for it. Yeah.
Okay. En masse, Democrat, Republican would tell you you're nuts to think that we should be sending...
I don't believe that.
Iraq and Syria. You've got to go after them in both places.
No combat troops on the ground. Is that enough?
I'm afraid it won't be.
This would mean a new theater war in Syria, but it would also mean sending tens of thousands of U.S. ground troops back into Iraq.
Air power alone, without having at least trainers and advisors from the United States on the ground, are not going to be successful.
I have dealt with the Iraqi security forces over the years. They are not prepared to handle the ground operation on their own.
The president keeps reassuring people as if this is a good thing that, U.S. troops will not be involved in combat. Why not?
So those of us who argued for getting into Syria in 2011, everyone said, oh no, it's very tough. It was. It is tough, and it will be very tough to get into Iraq now.
This is why I think Bill's notion, with all due respect, is fantastical, as an absurd. He's
the president of the United States. He's not running for re-election. Would Congress stop him if he did this?
Would the country support him?
And what if it didn't? What if his approval rating?
Yes, well, let us override the will of the people.
Yes, that is absolutely right.
The neoconservatives rallying behind more war in the Middle East became increasingly hubristic.
ISIS, what are we going to do about it?
Kill them. If they've got to be destroyed.
We are at war whether we like it or not.
That will require some more boots and support on the ground.
How? By supplying arms to
and then they would have ended up in the wrong hands.
The Muslims who wanted to fight it in Syria.
They wanted to fight Assad. That was the
And
issue.
they also wanted to fight ISIS.
No, they wanted to go after Assad.
Hillary Clinton has described already the meeting in the White House over 2 years ago. Everyone in the national security team recommended arming ISIS.
John McCain mixed up ISIS and the Syrian rebels he supported twice on live television interviews.
Your colleague Rand Paul said about it this morning. He said it's a mistake to arm them. Most of the arms that we've given the so-called moderate rebels have wound up in the hands of ISIS because ISIS simply takes it from them or it is given to them.
Has Rand Paul ever been to Syria? Has he ever met with ISIS? Has he ever met with any of these people? No. We're going to have a fight because it's patently false. But it's not true. I know these people. I'm in contact with them all the time.
All right, then let me ask you this.
And he is not. And he is not.
In what seemed like him misspeaking, perhaps an innocent error, a more disturbing truth lay underneath. John McCain, much like in Ukraine, was on the ground in Syria as an unspecified envoy from the U.S. government to the Syrian rebellion. His meeting with the rebel group, the Free Syrian Army, was accompanied by the Syrian Emergency Task Force Director, Muaz Mustafa.
But it's not true. I know these people. I'm in contact with them all the time. And we have to stop ISIS. And there's no doubt in my mind or anyone else's that they are a threat sooner or later.
Officials have turned to the mainstream media to make the link between the fight against ISIS and overthrowing Assad.
Or how you can go after Assad and ISIS at the same time. What do you mean? Do you mean like bomb them, both of them at the same time?
Yes, and I think, and also supplying weapons. The levels of bureaucracy and red tape that these guys are expected to go through. I mean, whatever happened to the Reagan doctrine, back in the 80s when we were, supplying, weapons to the Mujahideen? I mean, why can't we do it that way? I don't understand.
The Mujahideen, of course, would later become Al-Qaeda.
That worked out much better than
well, it did in the short term,
now.
but not in the long term. Okay.
Holy shit, Martin.
This all about Assad, because that's ultimately what this is about.
I don't really see it how removing Assad would help the fight against ISIS.
Why not?
I mean, you remove Assad, who can replace him? There will be a much larger security gap where ISIS could actually fail.
I think that's step one. I think there's obviously many more elements to combating this scourge, but I think Assad is going to have, getting rid of Assad is going to have to be a key element of that.
In a lot of ways, ISIS actually helped the neoconservative agenda in Syria, because the end goal was always to overthrow Bashir al-Assad.
The president has said long ago, Assad must go. I agree with that.
ISIS gave yet another excuse to wage war there. If ISIS gained territory, it benefited the neoconservative war agenda here, because that meant less territory for Bashir al-Assad. Eventually, the Obama administration caved and started an aerial bombing campaign of the country, only bombing ISIS strongholds, they said.
That is just one of more than 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles fired on militant targets in Syria. The Pentagon says 3 waves of attacks hit targets.
The battle against the Islamic State has been going on for the past 4 months. President Obama's decision to bomb Syria, especially if it leads to the overthrow of Assad. Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power recently said at a defense summit that arming the rebels and bombing Syria was in order for them to overthrow Assad, a position that President Obama has stood by.
Bill?
Well, I'm somewhat hard. This president would never go back in there. Now we're bombing at least some ISIS assets in Syria. Right now what we're doing may contain ISIS, may degrade them a little. It will not destroy them in Syria. And if we need to destroy this organization, I think, and that will mean a real war, not just some air war against oil. I'm happy he's doing what he's doing.
We won't see a land invasion again of Iraq and a massive occupation by U.S. troops under this president. The administration.
Well, that's what everyone's calling for.
He has intervened. It's not boots on the ground.
As of now, I think those airstrikes have not really been successful, even in terms of containment.
Since this was done partly with the permission from the Syrian and Russian governments, the neocons were still extremely disappointed by the U.S. strategy in Syria.
He's going to get dragged into eventually sending in the 20,000 troops or so that are needed to actually destroy ISIS.
I see that many.
Obama has now, 400, 500 strikes in Syria? He's now doing it. He's doing it now, so Putin must be trembling.
We have breaking news. Russia is launching its first airstrike in Syria. Moscow has been building its military presence there, a concern for many in the Obama administration.
All military intelligence indicators show that the Russians have conducted their first airstrike in Syria.
Let's talk about Putin for a second. Whether or not the world starts quaking.
Let's talk about Putin for a second. We've been talking about Putin and
the target, according to Putin, ISIS terrorists.
We will support the Syrian army only in its legitimate fight specifically against terrorist groups.
Syrian opposition groups supported by the United States said they too had been hit by Russian strikes. The United States now entangled in a diplomatic standoff with its former Cold War enemy.
I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria. I will not pursue an open-ended action like Iraq or Afghanistan.
Already already signs of further escalation. The Pentagon and NATO say Russia has moved ground troops into western Syria.
For the first time, U.S. pilots had to divert over Syria because a Russian fighter jet came within 20 nautical miles, according to U.S. officials. The U.S. doesn't think the Russians will shoot them down, but commanders don't trust Russia not to make a mistake.
So the other side would argue, as they are, that we'll look at the beheadings, the murders, the brutality and cruelty that the radical Islamists are inflicting upon their adversaries and the people of Iraq. Isn't that an evil to which we are the only ones can respond?
Well, first of all, it is an evil to which we contributed by our folly in invading Iraq back in 2003. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq under the previous order. I'm personally not persuaded that further military action in Iraq is actually going to produce an outcome more favorable than the last one.
You and I have been trying to make the case, I think, I have anyway, that liberals need to stand up for liberal principles. This is what I said on last week's show. Obviously, I got a lot of hate for it, but all I'm saying is that liberal principles like freedom of speech, freedom to practice any religion you want without fear of violence.
Investigative journalist Robert Perry has written extensively about this connection between neocons and liberal interventionists. He said the language may be different, but both sides' arguments boil down to regime change.
Freedom to leave a religion, equality for women, equality for minorities, including homosexuals. These are liberal principles that liberals applaud for.
I think the distinctions between neocon and liberal interventionists are almost evaporated.
You want to talk about the treatment of women and homosexuals and free thinkers and public intellectuals in the Muslim world. I would argue that liberals have failed us. And the crucial point of confusion, yeah, thank you.
Thank God you're here.
Yeah.
Russia also launched naval strikes, 4 warships in the Caspian Sea, firing 26 missiles into Syria. Pentagon officials believe it is a direct message to them from Moscow. We can fire at you from long distances.
And I live out in the suburbs, and I go into Washington as infrequently as I can. I mean, quite honestly, I don't like the Washington culture. I don't like the Washington parties. I don't like all of that stuff. And so I don't even know what's going on in Washington.
The clerk will call the roll.
Maybe coming up, sir. And you have nothing but eyes for these folks.
Manchin's here. And who else do we need?
Okay.
We have with us today 2 distinguished members of the National Defense Panel, Eric Edelman and Michelle Flournoy.
I'm going to let Ambassador Edelman go first.
Eric Edelman was called into the Senate as an expert to talk about national security threats. Edelman was no longer working for the U.S. government and was the co-founder of the Foreign Policy Initiative, a think tank largely sponsored by defense contractors.
The nation was running what he called accumulating strategic risk. And I think all of the members of the panel assented to that judgment at the time. That was before President Putin had invaded and annexed Crimea and destabilized eastern Ukraine, before the collapse of the Iraqi security forces and the seizure of Mosul and Anbar province by ISIL and its approach to Baghdad. The United States probably faces the most volatile and complex security environment that we've faced as a nation in a very long time, if ever.
Not a single senator on the Intelligence Committee questioned the validity of his claim that the year 2015 was the most dangerous year for U.S. national security in history.
I heard a lot of discussion about how there is no military solution to the problem in Ukraine.
Який бореться з москальською нечистю. Те, що зараз буде відбуватись. Давай його.
And that is, I think, demonstrably false. If we do nothing, there will be a military solution in Ukraine, and it's going to be the one that's imposed by Vladimir Putin. We also need to remember it's an important part of diplomacy. I always carry around with me a quotation from George Kennan, who says, "You have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy when you have a little quiet armed force in the background." And I think that we tend to, lose track of that. And it's the reason why I believe we do need to arm the Ukrainian government to raise the cost to President Putin. One thing I think is absolutely important to bear in mind, which is if we do this, we have to do this seriously. We cannot arm the Ukrainian government the way we've been arming the Syrian moderate opposition. And I think that's the beginning of wisdom on that subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I do recall a thing called the Reagan Doctrine, which was, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, won the Cold War without firing a shot. But maybe there's some of us who have different views of history. Your testimony has been very helpful.
In the Reagan years, as National Security Advisor, I could see that once the Cold War was behind us, that the enduring threat was radical Islam. And I began to look around for think tanks. And before long, it was evident that ISW, and specifically Dr. Kim Kagan, really understood this as a scholar, but also as a hands-on battlefield analyst.
Well, I think it's amazing what Kim Kagan has been able to do to build up this institute from scratch and to turn it into an incredibly valuable resource, not only for the public, but also for policymakers and for military commanders who are implementing policy on the ground.
The Institute for the Study of War was one of the first and only think tanks at this level, at the policy level.
ISW certainly has a major impact in policy circles. For example, the surge in Iraq.
In the case of Iraq, the Institute for the Study of War was basically the only organization within DC that was actually reporting on what the surge was, certainly guiding policy decisions.
So I think it's been a remarkable success story for the little think tank that could, and that is providing a real service to the national security community and to the national security of the United States. In many ways, put them ahead of where I think the U.S. government was.
I think that the ISW's role, most importantly for me, is just providing the information and the objective tools that I need as a member of Congress to be able to not only explain to my constituency in a coherent way, but also formulate the opinions that I have when I make those decisive votes on the House floor for how we're going to move forward.
That's been a real missing piece that ISW fills by connecting the military with the public and with the policymakers.
With ISW, I really feel like, I'm being presented with the facts and the evidence, and I can make my own conclusion from there.
ISW certainly has a major impact in policy circles.
Informative.
Extraordinarily useful.
Effective.
They're the best.
Founded by the sister-in-law of Robert Kagan and wife of Fred Kagan, Kimberly Kagan, The Institute for the Study of War did a brilliant job of removing itself from the tainted recent history of the neoconservative movement.
The question is, what do we do about the fact that there is a large al-Qaeda splinter group that has a terrorist safe haven right now in Iraq and Syria that can threaten us? We have to focus on that problem and stop feeling as though the decisions in 2003 are at the root of this problem. It doesn't matter. We have to deal with this crisis right now.
There have been several mentions of Richard Kagan. I wanted to point out the fact
Robert
that
Kagan, just FYI.
Oh, sorry, of course. That 10 to 12 years ago, he and his brother and sister, who were frequently on C-SPAN, were among the biggest promoters of the invasion of Iraq, which has turned into an utter disaster.
Kim Kagan, president of the Institute for the Study of War.
Is there, would you be a neocon?
People use that term, and I don't really know what that means. I don't define myself.
Does your husband?
No.
Are you a neocon?
I really don't know what that means anymore.
Let me start with a clip from December the 9th, 2005, when somebody named Kagan appeared on one of our call-in shows.
My brother is Bob Kagan, and there's another Kagan coming behind me, my wife, Kim Kagan.
What does she do?
I'm a military analyst and a military historian. I am the president of the Institute for the Study of War, which is a nonpartisan think tank here in Washington, D.C.
I'm joined today by my friend Fred Kagan, a fellow scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Critical Threats Project at AEI.
Fred and I come at problems from our experience as historians and also our experiences at West Point. It really, I think, is unusual for a civilian to be able to see the fruits of teaching officership.
In southern Baghdad, right in the heart of it, we will get to that, certainly.
As I told you before we started, I want to try to connect the dots. And to do that...
if I was a casual observer reading the book for the first time, I would still have no idea the extent to which you yourself were involved in the search. You detach yourself well within the book, probably because you're a very humble person.
You're probably best known if you ask someone on the street in Washington, Fred Kagan, architect of the Iraq surge. So that was 2006.
What, was your role in putting this together? Because it's more than just an academic exercise. You didn't build this in an ivory tower.
Ms. Kagan, you seem to be somewhat of an apologist for the administrations of past. I mean, Saddam Hussein allowed us to inspect. For 12 years, we went through sanctions and inspections, and Scott Ritter said there was no weapons. There was just so much conflict of interest.
Why do you do this?
Well, as you know, it is a cornerstone of our democracy that civilians actually have some very important decision-making power about military affairs.
The great thing about doctrinal terms is that everybody knows what they mean. So if I say the mission is defeat the enemy, everybody from the four-star general to the lieutenant knows exactly what is meant by that.
And in order for our democracy to flourish, civilian policymakers must be able to evaluate commanders, evaluate strategies, and make determinations about what our nation's overall policy should be.
What the Kagans do, actually, is they grade my work on a daily basis. And you think I'm joking.
Her career spent more than 17 months advising U.S. commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I'm here to conduct an assessment for General McChrystal.
And as I stated, you seem to be an apologist rather than someone who's being somewhat honest, because the last question that the Twitter person had posed was the most important one. Thank you, C-SPAN.
Anthony, thanks for the call. And this from Jan, who says, what is our gain if we go into Iraq again? So to both of these points.
On August 8, 2011, the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank in Washington, was founded by a woman named Kimberly Kagan, hosted a dinner for General David Petraeus, who had just returned back to the United States about a month earlier after relinquishing command in Afghanistan. Her husband, Fred, works at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank in...
Well, there's nothing that we can do short of an attack to force Iran to give up its nuclear program.
Both of them went out together to work for General Petraeus for 10 months while he was in charge in Afghanistan.
The fact that I've had the privilege to watch General Petraeus at work day in and day out has been an extraordinary and special occasion.
So usually these think tank experts show up for visits anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks.
It has been amazing to watch him go into a morning meeting and take briefings.
They wound up essentially working as de facto staff officers for General Petraeus. They had desks in his headquarters. They had the highest level security clearances that allowed them to read sensitive intelligence reports and communications intercepts.
And each day then I go back and I watch the secure internet and here comes the email from the Kagans. And it's always very alarmed. It's always very concerned. And I've always screwed something up and I've been wrong. But seldom do I admit that. But the next morning they will hear me echo what, of course, they suggested. And
because the Kagans didn't really exist in the chain of command, which meant that they could go directly to Petraeus. They didn't have to work through other layers of subordinate staff officers.
There is some suspicion that actually there's a hand up my back that makes my lips talk, and it's operated by one of the Doctors Kagans.
Lawyers are examining the specific arrangement between Petraeus and the Kagans to ensure that it fully complied with those regulations. The extraordinary access that the Kagans had to Petraeus, to the headquarters in Kabul, coming on the heels of the disclosures of what we now know about the relationship that Paula Broadwell, Petraeus' biographer turned lover, also had in Kabul, really raises new questions. While they weren't being paid by the federal government, they did continue to receive their salaries from their respective think tanks.
Through your generosity to ISW.
She was getting a paycheck from the Institute for the Study of War. That paycheck was in part funded by the Institute's donors. Some of those donors who were in attendance at that dinner included defense contractors and others with potential business interests in Afghanistan.
The era that we live in today has created a new type of flexible power broker that maneuvers among government, consultancy, think tank, and media roles.
Shadow elite.
Example, there was a woman who wrote a piece about arming the Syrian rebels.
This woman, who has regularly appeared on CNN and other networks.
This is Elizabeth Baggy.
Yes, yes.
Elizabeth O'Baggy.
Dr. Elizabeth O'Baggy.
She works with the Institute of War.
She was presented as someone affiliated with a think tank.
O'Baggy was a senior analyst at the Institute for the Study of War.
Now, think tanks have this imprimatur of neutral and academic. She wasn't a neutral analyst.
But it turns out she also works for an organization that advocates for the Syrian rebels.
Only later did it turn out that she had a dog in the fight.
The Syrian Emergency Task Force.
In the sense that she was affiliated with a group that was supporting the rebels.
That was not disclosed at the time. As the Obama administration prepared its case for military force, O'Baggy wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. She argued that, quote, moderate opposition groups make up the majority of actual fighting forces.
There is a real moderate opposition that exists.
The op-ed was cited just days later by Senator John McCain.
And yet, in the meantime, what is the damage done? The damage done is that her argument was picked up by Secretary of State John Kerry and John McCain.
Today, the Institute for the Study of War fired O'Baggy, saying in a statement, quote, contrary to her representations, Ms. Elizabeth O'Baggy does not, in fact, have a PhD degree.
She doesn't have a PhD this
week.
Right,
so there's also another issue.
ISW has accordingly terminated Ms. O'Baggy's employment, effective immediately. Even so, the founder of ISW defended the content of the op-ed as rock solid in an interview with Politico today.
Kagan and the ISW acted surprised in their official statement that Obagi also worked for the Syrian Emergency Task Force. But how could they not know that? Kim Kagan knew that these people hung out socially. Evan Barrett of the Syrian Emergency Task Force is good friends with Josh Rogan of Bloomberg, formerly of the Daily Beast. This wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was completely transparent and out in the open. Hardly anybody raised the question of conflict of interest until a scandal like the Obagi one arose.
So it creates a problem of accountability.
Thanks to all of you for supporting an organization that I think General Keane very accurately described as filling a niche. Thank you.
Still, it's all part of this weird world in Washington, an echo chamber of paid pseudo-experts.
And we, the public, don't have the tools to quite know what these power brokers are up to.
A doctor who is not a doctor, writing an op-ed testifying for the rebels without disclosing that she is paid for by a rebel advocacy group, and it all ends up as evidence in a case for attacking.
As has been said, why does the dog wag its tail? Because the dog is smarter than the tail.
No, wait a second. Wait a second. No.
Intelligence analysis conducted at the Institute for the Study of War has informed senior policy leaders and military commanders. Integrating data sets from community stakeholders could further enhance understanding of the evolution of the ground conflict in Syria.
This happens all the time. It's not about this particular case or any particular case, but it happens all the time.
So please join me in a toast to a truly great, wonderful American, Joe Lieberman. To Joe Lieberman.
You know, to what extent is this behavior that we're seeing, is it corrupt? A lot of it is really ambiguous.
This is a group that is committed to the destruction of everything decent in the world.
They want to destroy our way of life, all right? Okay.
I see deliberate enemy operations, which you can actually depict on a map, and I commend to you a terrific report by the Institute for the Study of War called ISIS Captures Ramadi, which actually has a military, old-fashioned military-style map showing the ISIS maneuvers because they are maneuvering.
The Institute for the Study of War monopolized the think tank industry in terms of U.S. war analytics.
Now at the map, the research director at the Institute for the Study of War and former U.S. Army intelligence officer, Jessica Lewis, who's an expert on ISIS. Jessica, you and I have talked about this before.
So involved in the day-to-day strategic battle plans of the U.S. military that their maps became a standard, appearing almost daily in U.S. media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Bloomberg, and even Mashable.
If you go back to earlier definitions, classic definitions of corruption, you see that they're often about violating the public trust.
When you heard that Obama was carrying this around, where were you and what was your reaction? What was your feeling?
Well, I was here in Washington, and I was delighted, of course, because no author is troubled by the fact that the president is reading his book. You can't get a better advertisement than that.
The ISW managed to plug themselves so deeply into the foreign policy-making brain trust in Washington, D.C., that hardly anyone noticed what their true motives might be. An obvious motive would be helping weapons sales, as the ISW was entirely funded by the biggest defense companies in the United States, like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. It seemed that Kim Kagan was even more successful in disassociating herself from neoconservatism compared to her husband Fred or her brother-in-law Robert. And in general, the ISW itself was taken more seriously than the Foreign Policy Initiative, which had already been coined PNAC 2.0 by critics.
And a lot of this Flexian activity really does violate the public trust. And that's what we should be concerned about.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
If you're just joining us, my name's Chris Griffin. I'm the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative.
Matt Duss, National Security Editor for ThinkProgress.org. He attended the Foreign Policy Initiative conference today. There are these guys here who said back in 2001 that Afghanistan's already won, mission accomplished. Then they made the case that we should go on ahead into Iraq. Those are the guys that were at this conference today. Does that mean that their conference was a whoops, we sure blew it apology conference?
Well, certainly not.
What we need to understand, this is where I think Americans, and not just American people, not just the average voter, but even American policymakers need to understand foreign policy is hard.
There's never really been any accountability for these guys or any admission that any of their fantasies about transforming the world at the point of an American gun were kind of ridiculous.
You don't succeed most of the time. I say in the book, foreign policy is like hitting a baseball. You know, if you fail 70% of the time, you go to the Hall of Fame.
Yes, right.
And
what we initially framed as the crisis in the Middle East at the beginning of the year, and as the year progressed, we modified the title to be the chaos in the Middle East.
There's really no admission that these ideas have simply been discarded.
Robert Kagan was saying that he does not consider himself a neocon anymore. He considers himself a liberal interventionist.
And as part of this project that they're now trying to rebrand themselves.
The Project for a New American Century was thrust into the spotlight. And although many think that the neocons lost power when Bush left office, these shady operatives have taken a cue from Blackwater and only rebranded themselves.
They've just kind of moved on to their new attempt to rebrand themselves as a bipartisan foreign policy organization.
FPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that makes the case for American leadership and engagement in the world.
look, my approach to foreign policy and the approach of this book is a bipartisan approach. It's one that presidents from Truman to Reagan have followed. So I'm glad to have both sides taking a look at it. There is something of a bipartisan foreign policy tradition in the United States.
Well, I'll tell you, Obama shows no signs of being the kind of guy who holds a grudge.
He's post-partisan, man. Kim Kagan, who is the founder and president of the Institute for the Study of War, an organization whose work I could not more highly recommend that you check out, and invaluable in our work.
It was kind of a reunion.
Thanks to those of you on our C-SPAN audience who are following along.
The theme of this year's forum, which is FPI's 5th, is Will America Lead?
I think you've had a long morning already, so we're going to liven it up a little bit on the stage here.
But surely the FBI was able to garner attention in D.C. with the involvement of people like Robert Kagan. Or was it?
Jointly hosted by the Foreign Policy Initiative. Join me in welcoming Senator Tom Cotton.
Thanks to FPI and to AAF for hosting me this morning for the very important work you do. We have systematically underfunded our military. The result of this experiment should come as no surprise or little different than the results of the same experiment in the 1930s.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to be here.
The Code Pink protesters who crashed a nearly empty FPI event with Tom Cotton looked bored to death. One of them staring into her cell phone as she walked out of the proceedings.
What was his response? Yes, certainly, death to America. This is not the man or the regime to whom we should ever make nuclear concessions. And in fact,
in an accidental hot mic recording before the start of a foreign policy initiative talk.
How you doing? Edward Burrier. Nice to meet you. Thanks for again for
talking about stocks.
Short narrative.
These chairs, they're really nice. People have notes up here.
Yeah. I'm used to like more of a table. You guys good? Test my skills.
The host expressed disappointment that only 5 people are interested in this stuff.
I don't know. There are like 5 people who care about this stuff, and that's about it.
Well, these people here.
But a few seconds later, he uses his knowledge of the policymaking scene to explain to a staffer how he should get to know another staffer because they share mutual goals.
He's been trying to push something. You guys are pushing, but and I said, I figure, hey, he's young. He's been at the job for about 1.5 years, 2 years. So it's someone you usually don't know. Yeah, and vice versa,
So maybe the FBI was influential among certain key people or policymakers, like Paul Wolfowitz, who is seen here attending one of their conferences.
And of course, Dr. Kagan is best known for
My team at the Critical Threats Project and the team at the Institute for the Study of War.
Fred Kagan was in charge of a wing at the American Enterprise Institute that featured regular writings by Thomas Donnelly and Gary Schmidt called the Critical Threats Project. In conjunction with the ISW, the Critical Threats Project released a series of detailed strategy guides on how to defeat ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. In what could be described as a PNAC reunion, these strategists found a home at AEI's Critical Threats Project. In reality, it wasn't necessarily about what think tanks these people belonged to. It was a matter of who these people actually were and how their ideas spread.
Tom Donnelly and Gary Schmidt, who have had distinguished careers here in Washington and government and outside, and think tanks and other notorious institutions that we've worked together on a little bit.
And from PNAC and the Kagan family sprung an army of loyal foot soldiers for the neocon agenda, trickling down to all of DC foreign policy making culture.
And you've issued a very important new report. Let's just begin with that. To rebuild America's military.
Thomas Donnelly and Schmidt decided to dust off and resurrect their original rallying cry for war, PNAC's Rebuilding America's Defenses.
Does it really need to be rebuilt? It's so much bigger than everyone else's. Isn't this what people in the defense and foreign policy world always say? Or what do you argue here? And
the U.S. military has a job to do, and it has to be adequate to the task. It's been reduced in size. Its equipment has gotten older by every measure. It's not what it used to be.
One of the things I think that's not really fully appreciated is that we've really been not modernizing, recapitalizing the military since the end of the Cold War. We've been left with a kind of Reagan buildup. We've added some things, but not at the scale that required for doing the tasks that Tom just talked about. The other thing I would say is that there's often like this sort of silly comparison, which is the Chinese military budget is X and ours is 4 times X.
Right.
But what that ignores, of course, is that the Chinese military is dealing with a certain part of the world, whereas we have security treaties and global obligations.
In fact, the armed forces budget needs to be increased significantly. We need to have a total of 15,000 to 20,000 U.S. troops in Iraq in order to provide the necessary enablers. I think anything less than that is simply unserious.
The last collaboration between ISW and the Critical Threats Project about defeating ISIS said we need about 25,000 to 30,000 ground troops in Syria and Iraq. In perfect harmony, the work of the PNAC alumni fed directly into the negative attention that ISIS craved.
This is our Khilafah in all its glory. 8 times the size of Belgium and 30 times the size of Qatar. It's a state built on the prophetic methodology.
ISIS continued to make extremely well-produced videos.
A secular state built on man-made laws whose soldiers fight for the interests of Taghut legislators, liars, fornicators, corporations.
This time they decided to release one narrated in English, using American-style post-production effects mocking our soldiers as cowards and taunting the U.S. government for being unable to defeat them.
America, you claim to have the greatest army history has known. You may have the numbers and weapons, but your soldiers lack the will and resolve. They return dead or suicidal, with 18 of your soldiers committing suicide each day before you've even advanced. Then, the flames of war will finally burn you on the hills of death. Bring it on.
The American election season and the debates were nearing. For the GOP side especially, which had 17 contenders in the primary, ISIS videos made it so that candidates and super PACs didn't have to use their imagination much to induce fear.
Serious times require serious leadership. Take out ISIS with overwhelming force. We are at war with radical Islamic terrorism. We have but one choice: to defeat it.
I'm Jeb Bush, and I approve this message.
Securing our borders and stopping illegal immigration is a matter of national security.
The conservative hot-button topic of illegal immigration got merged with stopping ISIS.
To admit Syrian refugees, including ISIS terrorists, that's just wrong.
If you join ISIS, if you wage jihad on America, then you are signing your death warrant. When it comes to radical Islamic terrorism, I think we need to rediscover Ronald Reagan's strategy. We win, they lose.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
This is a civilizational struggle between the values of freedom and liberty and radical Islamic terror. These are radical terrorists who want to kill us because we let women drive, because we let girls go to school. I'm Marco Rubio. I approve this message because there can be no arrangement or negotiation. Either they win or we do.
A pissing contest of who could be the most callous in waging the fight against ISIS was on the horizon. Donald Trump's ads went a step further.
That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Rand Paul sees chance to be GOP dove, the dove.
Look at the substance of the position. At the end of the day, Rand Paul is for retreat from the world. He's got a principled, more or less neo-isolationist view. He doesn't think we need to be on the offensive around the world. I think that's a dangerous policy. I believe the Republican Party will end up nominating a national security hawk, not a Ron Paul neo-isolationist.
Paul intends to contrast himself with his rivals on foreign policy at this Thursday's debate. Paul vowed that he will ask his Republican presidential rivals face-to-face where they want to always intervene in every civil war around the world. I want to be known as the candidate who's not eager for war, who thinks war is the last resort, Paul said.
What do you do if chemical weapons end up in the hands of radical Islamic terrorists like ISIS? ISIS right now is the face of evil.
You have radical jihadists in dozens of countries across multiple continents, not just in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS is now in Libya and in Afghanistan, and a growing presence in Pakistan.
There are millions of radical Islamic terrorists who seek to kill us.
Soon they'll be in Turkey, they'll try Jordan.
They have promised to take jihad to our shores.
ISIS is the group that wants to trigger an apocalyptic showdown. They hate us because of our values.
They chop off heads. They're chopping off heads. These are animals.
They're beheading children.
They hate us because our girls go to school.
They drown 40, 50, 60 people at a time in big steel cages.
ISIS is the group that burns people alive in cages.
They are crucifying Christians.
And they even recruit Americans using social media.
They are laughing at us. They are laughing at us.
They win or we win. We better take this risk seriously. They are coming for us.
And we need to take out ISIS with every tool at our disposal.
Knock out ISIS and all of the others that are so bad.
But we need to destroy ISIS and dispose of Assad.
They need to be defeated militarily, and that will take overwhelming U.S. force.
We can create a force that will take out ISIS.
The neocon advisors are once again feeding the talking point that we needed boots on the ground in Syria.
But in the long term, ISIS must be defeated on the ground.
To defeat ISIS, it would require more boots on the ground, if you will, or more troops on the ground.
The necessity here is that they will involve some coalition of ground forces to defeat ISIS.
It is our job to kill terrorists, hunt them down wherever they are.
I would hit them, Brian, so hard.
The vigorousness with which I will utterly and completely destroy ISIS.
I would knock the hell out of ISIS. You have to knock them out. You have to knock them off strong. Let them fight each other and pick up the remnants.
The ways in which they tried to one-up each other were creative and disturbing.
We will carpet bomb them into oblivion.
Carpet bombing against ISIS.
And you talk about seeing if the sand will glow at night. Well, Chris, I will apologize to nobody.
When he talks about this, quote, carpet bombing ISIS, do y'all go for that?
Yes.
Yes.
Marco Rubio said we should film American special forces killing ISIS members in order to humiliate them.
I believe we need to subject ISIS to high-profile, humiliating defeats, meaning special operations attacks that are filmed, basically.
You said that the U.S. has to, quote, take out the families of terrorists.
Donald Trump said that we should kill the families of terrorists.
With the terrorists, you have to take out their families. When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. I would bomb the shit out of them. I would just bomb those suckers. I'd blow up every single inch. There would be nothing left.
Honestly,
Chicken shit.
The violent rhetoric took on cartoonish proportions.
You said that the U.S. should bomb ISIS back into the Stone Age. Should that take congressional approval?
It should absolutely take congressional approval.
Marco Rubio saying the president doesn't need Congress. He should act swiftly on his own.
Senator Rubio accused Senator Cruz of talking tough on ISIS but not backing it up.
Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio avoided facing the aggressiveness of Trump as much as possible, squabbling amongst themselves about who was the bigger hawk.
He has also supported, by the way, a budget that would radically reduce the amount of money we spend on our military. You can't carpet bomb ISIS if you don't have planes and bombs to attack them with.
Marco has accused you of helping to create ISIS.
Well, you know, the opposite is kind of true.
It was already clear that Rubio was a de facto neocon candidate, based on how many of his attacks were focused on Rand Paul. Paul still posed an ideological threat to the hawkish consensus in the GOP race.
I know that Rand is a committed isolationist. I'm not. I believe the world is a stronger and a better place.
He was given very little time to make counterpoints, yet he attempted to point out the real roots of ISIS.
Arming the allies of al-Qaeda, which became ISIS. That was the dumbest, most foolhardy notion, and most of the people up here supported it. They wanted to arm the allies of al-Qaeda. Some of them still do. That's how ISIS grew. We pushed back Assad, and ISIS was allowed to grow in the vacuum.
You know, when you get in these debates with Rubio, it must be easy. Just talk to a neocon. He's just a neocon. Rubio had already gained the support of several neoconservatives who played big roles in the push for the Iraq War. We all know their names, led by Bill Kristol, the Weekly Standard.
I'm very much for younger candidates. I'm for people who are younger than Rand Paul. Marco Rubio and Paul Ryan and Tom Cotton, who are all national security hawks, are younger than Rand Paul. I'm all for having younger candidates, and I just think Rand Paul is too old.
Robert Kagan, another Bush national security advisor, they're all pushing for Rubio. He sings the song of the Hawks every time he gets in front of a microphone.
And we are going to be loyal to our allies like Israel, not enemies like Iran. And we are rebuilding our military, and then the best military in the world, which needs to be rebuilt. And yes, I do want to rebuild the American military. We are going to rebuild that military, and that military is going to find the terrorists and destroy them. We'll rebuild the U.S. military so no one will dare test it. Vote for me. We will make the 21st century a new American century. And the 21st century can be a new American century. The 21st century is going to be the new American century.
Is he a robot?
A programmed guy, yeah.
Who programmed him? One of the neocons?
Vote for me.
And ask all of you to please join me in welcoming Senator Rubio.
Who wrote this script for him?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here at the Foreign Policy Initiative again.
What's a neocon?
An absolute hawk.
I see in Rubio a dangerous vessel vehicle for the neocon forces which have damaged our country, reassembling around him. And I think his youthful exuberance masks regressive and old policy.
Several of the names on Marco Rubio's foreign policy dream team were signatories on many of the Project for the New American Century letters, dating back all the way to 1998. Among the list of people on his foreign policy dream team were Dan Senor and Eric Edelman, two of the 4 founders of the Foreign Policy Initiative. His 7-point plan for defeating ISIS seems straight out of the Institute for Study of War's Defeating ISIS pamphlet.
I think Hillary Clinton is a neocon. I think she's I think Hillary Clinton's a neoconservative, and I think that she and Marco Rubio are very similar in their foreign policy.
Rand Paul's presence in the race was fading fast, but before he left the stage, he generated controversy by using the word neocon to attack not just Rubio, but also Hillary Clinton.
How do you view Hillary Clinton in terms of her foreign policy views?
I see her as a neoconservative. I see her and
Neoconservative.
I see her and Rubio as being the same person.
They both believe in regime change. They both believe in a no-fly zone over there.
They both want a no-fly zone.
I am advocating the no-fly zone, both because I think it would help us on the ground.
They both have supported pouring arms into the Syrian civil war, a mistake that I think allowed ISIS to grow stronger.
Airstrikes will have to be combined with ground forces actually taking back more territory from ISIS. We have to fight them in the air, we have to fight them on ground, and we have to fight them on the internet.
Well, this is something that actually unites Marco Rubio and Hillary Clinton because they both believe in regime change. They both supported the regime change in Libya.
We came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? I'm sure it did.
Is Libya perfect? It isn't.
They both believe in confronting Russia.
I've never met Vladimir Putin, but I know enough about him to know he's a gangster. A gangster in Moscow is not just threatening Europe, he's threatening to destroy and divide NATO.
If there's a no-fly zone, which you're advocating.
I'm also advocating it because I think it gives us some leverage in our conversations with Russia.
And the Russians invade that no-fly zone. Would President Clinton say, shoot it down?
We're going to put up a no-fly zone. Very difficult to build relationships with some people, and I'm talking about you, Vladimir. The Russians will continue their bombing, try to do everything they can to destroy what's left of the opposition.
The no-fly zone, I would hope, would be also shared by Russia.
Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton clarified comments she made one day earlier when she compared Russian President Vladimir Putin with Hitler in the 1930s.
But you know, Hillary is more hawkish than any of us.
Right.
She's comparing Putin and the Russians to Nazis.
Clinton said she was not comparing Putin to Hitler, but simply saying
that is reminiscent of claims that were made back in the 1930s when Germany under the Nazis.
In fact, all parties should avoid steps that could be misinterpreted at this delicate time.
The neoconservatives, they've been on both sides of every war. The only thing consistent about their message is we should always be at war.
Unfortunately, instead of doubling down on his non-interventionist position, over time, Paul backed down, refusing to call out any neocons by name when pressed repeatedly on Fox News by Megyn Kelly.
Because you've been saying a lot about neocons, and who are they? In your mind, you know, who are they? What section of the Republican Party do you mean?
It's more of a philosophy.
Is it like Bill Kristol?
It's more of a philosophy, and they will know when you talk about them. They will know who they are. Thing is, we can have an honest disagreement.
I know, but I'm just trying to understand who you mean.
The reason I don't choose to bring up names is I don't want to make this about personalities.
You want to name names when you're criticizing or blasting these so-called neocons?
Senator Rand Paul now says he would destroy ISIS militarily, but his tough talk is at odds with his earlier views, prompting him to write an essay this week in Time magazine titled, "I Am Not an Isolationist."
You once said Iran was not a threat. Now you say it is. You once proposed ending foreign aid to Israel. You now support it, at least for the time being. And you once offered to drastically cut... Once drastically wanted to cut defense spending, and now you want to increase it 16%. So I just wonder if you've mellowed out.
Yeah, why don't we let me explain instead of talking over me, okay?
Would have been a more robust debate had Rand stuck to his more sort of pure libertarian approach on foreign policy, but...
Why don't you ask me a question? Have I changed my opinion?
Have you changed your opinion?
That would be sort of a better way to approach an interview.
Okay.
No.
Is Iran still not a threat?
No. Listen.
This is someone who's now signed the Tom Cotton letter to Iran.
What about your dad's comments about he's not that happy Republicans are back in charge because he thinks it might lead to, you know, the neocons increasing their presence in Iraq and Syria?
Well, I hope that didn't refer to me. I hope I haven't joined the neocon cabal. So,
I mean, when you sit at Thanksgiving table with your dad, I mean, do you guys like throwing turkey legs at each other or what?
No.
I give you my friend and hopefully the next senator from Texas, Ted Cruz.
God bless Rand Paul. Did y'all know that Hannity, they always film Fox from the waist up, so he's always in jeans?
Yeah. I thought we were going back to last night's debate about body parts. All right, go ahead.
I make fun of Bill Clinton all the time. There's a lot of hot chicks over there on that side of you.
And I'll play off your little humor bit. There might be something that you and Donald Trump can put together. We have evil in our...
I'm terrified.
Yeah. It might work out. You might like this. Because ISIS is evil in our time. You agree? I think everybody in this audience understands the evil that we face. And for this generation coming up, we have got to stop this evil in its tracks. You have stated that you think we should carpet bomb the Islamic State, which, by the way, is Islamic, President Obama.
You know, you gotta have some fun with it. You gotta laugh.
The neocons seemed to be betting on several horses at once, even though Cruz was their least preferable choice.
What I can't understand is if you really care, some neocons say they're very pro. Are we ready to go? We're getting ready. Let's go. Casey Hunnit's got Donald Trump. Just excuse me. We'll be right back to you.
He's way through the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump.
It's amazing.
You know,
Donald Trump.
I'm angry because our country is a mess.
Look,
but I'll build the military stronger, bigger, better than anybody up here, and nobody's going to mess with us. That I can tell you. We're going to win with Trump. We're going to win. We don't win anymore. Our country doesn't win anymore. We're going to win with Trump. And people back down with Trump. And that's what I like, and that's what the country is going to like.
Even though Trump in a lot of ways represented the authoritarian patriotic spirit neocons had been stirring up since 9/11,
I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
some of Trump's actual campaign platforms were such a drastic left turn from what the neocons wanted to hear that the more ground Trump gained, the more they started to panic.
I think I'd get along very well with Vladimir Putin. I just think so. People would say, what do you mean? I think I'd get along well with him.
Vladimir Putin is not going to be an ally of the United States. The whole world knows this. It's a simple, basic fact.
I would get along with Putin. I've dealt with Russia.
Do you think you'd get along with Putin?
I think I'd get along with him fine. I think he'd be absolutely fine.
The neocons did not like what he was saying about Russia and Putin.
The editorial that Putin wrote in the New York Times was amazing. It was just amazing.
And they hated what he was saying about Iraq.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake. I'm the only one on the stage that said, do not go into Iraq. Do not attack Iraq. Nobody else on this stage said that, and I said it loud and strong.
While Rand Paul was the only overtly anti-war voice coming into the debates, he was only polling at 1%, which gave Donald Trump an opportunity to steal Rand Paul's thunder by stepping on his anti-war stance and making it his own.
I'm the only person up here that fought against going into Iraq.
Can I make a response to
just
that?
excuse me 1 second,
Can I make
you
a
don't mind,
response to
Rand.
that?
You know, you are on less. You do have your 1%.
May I
What I
make a
said
response
was
to
you're
that?
going to destabilize the Middle East, and that's what happened.
So
He's referred to me
no,
in
the
his
first
remarks.
chance.
May I make a response?
You're having a hard time tonight.
All right,
Mr. Trump, in Iraq, I was the one that said, don't go, don't do it. You're going to destabilize the Middle East. You'll destabilize the Middle East. That's exactly what happened. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. I'm not one with a trigger. Other people up here, believe me, would be a lot faster. We got to fight ISIS first. You fight ISIS first.
This is the problem. Donald Trump brought up the fact that he'd want to accommodate Russia.
Can't fight two wars at one time. If you listen to him, and that's why we've been in the Middle East for 15 years.
Trump continued to contradict neocon positions in Syria.
On the ground with our special operators to destroy ISIS and bring about stability, and you can't do that with Assad in power.
We're supporting troops that we don't even know who they are.
Okay,
We're supporting
this is
troops
ridiculous.
that we don't even know who they are. We've spent $5 trillion in the Middle East because of thinking like that.
Even more than his economic positions, Trump's foreign policy views challenge GOP orthodoxy in fundamental ways.
Jeb Bush.
I could care less about the insults that Donald Trump gives to me. It's blood sport for him. He enjoys it, and I'm glad he's happy about it.
Took him 5 days before his people told him what to say. George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty.
I am sick and tired of him going after my family.
My brother, who I adore as well, is a fantastic brother, was president. Fine, I'll take it.
Jeb Bush was being weakened by the intensity of Trump.
2 days ago, he said he would take his pants off and moon everybody, and that's fine. Nobody reports that. Let me talk quiet. A lot of times.
While Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe, and I'm proud of what he did.
He dropped out not long after Trump attacked George W. Bush, his brother, for not keeping us safe on 9/11.
He's had the gall to go after
the World Trade Center came down during
the
brother's
go after
reign.
my
Remember
mother.
that. The World Trade Center came down during the reign. He kept us safe. That's not safe. That is not safe, Mark.
All right.
So tonight, I am suspending my campaign. Yeah.
Trump was sweeping each election state by state, racking up delegate counts far exceeding any other candidate.
But he jumped the shark yesterday. He's dead to me. And no, seriously.
He's dead to you.
Yeah, seriously.
Ted Cruz was in a distant second.
Donald, relax.
Go ahead. I'm relaxed. You're the basket case.
But the neocon darling Marco Rubio was trailing far behind.
Wait. Don't worry about it, little Marco.
Gentlemen.
Now, one group is bitterly digging in against him, the hawkish foreign policy elites known as neoconservatives or neocons.
So it's not surprising now that we see a lot of sort of mainline neocons, people like Robert Kagan, Max Boot. We saw the Emergency Committee for Israel start running ads against Donald Trump.
What is the Emergency Committee for Israel?
Bill Kristol is on their board.
Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol.
The GOP was panicking over the prospect of what seemed like an inevitable Trump nomination.
The party elders, as we know, have all been scrambling to try to come up with some way of thwarting him, of stopping him.
You know, he probably won't be the nominee because he is irresponsible in things that he says and sometimes says distasteful things.
The problem with that is Donald Trump feeds on the hue and outcry against him.
A lot of them are pouring money into attacking Donald Trump.
People don't want to coalesce behind Donald Trump because they don't think he's an appropriate nominee for the party. But that's a fact.
But the neoconservative wing of the GOP especially started to have a full-blown meltdown.
Bing, bing, bong, bong.
Like a canary in a coal mine, Robert Kagan wrote a scathing editorial about how racists, bigots, and essentially idiots in the Republican Party were responsible for the Frankenstein monster they created, mixed together with a kind of creepy Oedipus metaphor. Robert Kagan was not alone. Other neocons in DC shared the same view. But was it a genuine position? Did they actually believe that Republicans, but just not themselves, were responsible for Donald Trump's rise?
So Trump came roaring in through this primary. He was like a golden wrecking ball.
After a fairly long lull, the neocons in DC started to write letters again, this time not under the name PNAC, under the name of an obscure blog called War on the Rocks. By all appearances, this was another PNAC letter, the newest in a long series of PNAC letters. The tone of this letter was essentially concern over Trump, in the same way they were concerned over Saddam Hussein. With over 120 signatures and signed by almost all the same people who signed the most important PNAC letters, this was a bringing the band back together moment. Jim Loeb described it as a project for the anti-Trump century. Was it that unpredictable that the neocons would be uncomfortable with Trump and his anti-war rhetoric? Jim Loeb and others suggested that this was enough to break ties between the neocons and Trump. But what if this was something more opportunistic on the part of the neocons? Robert Kagan, in the letter written by the Project for the Anti-Trump Century, both clobbered Trump and his supporters for being Islamophobic or anti-Muslim. This was a very strange thing to hear from a neoconservative group. Many critics of neoconservatives feel that they share a large part of the blame for the post-9/11 wave of Islamophobia. So was Trump mostly to blame for reigniting Islamophobia, racism, and bloodthirst in this country? Or were the same neocons who were trying to stop Trump to blame?
He wrecked what needed to be wrecked.
Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, bing, bing. You know what that is, right?
America is an enormously destructive country. People around the world love us, and many of them dread us because we undo them every day. We undo them in every area of life, whether it's business or economics, or whether it's entertainment or sports, just across the board. Creative destruction is our middle name, and we threaten everybody's stability. Some of our professional diplomats is that they always stress the endless desirability of stability. When stability is not what we want, and stability is not what the United States is about. We are the one great revolutionary society in the world, and we want revolution. We don't want stability. We want to bring these people down.
I was sitting in a bar on Capitol Hill, and I was told by a congressional staffer, careful how you use the word neoconservative. People might think you're being anti-Semitic. Can you just explain this for me?
I mean, it's no secret. The majority of neoconservatives have been and remain Jewish.
You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
I think one of the greatest lies of this whole Israel debate is the claim that you hear by so many people that you can't criticize Israel without being called an anti-Semite, which is so annoying, because I've never heard anyone legitimately criticize Israel and be called an anti-Semite for it. I've heard anti-Semites. Well, Joe, you wrote that the Iraq War was because of neocons plumping for war. You said that it raised the question of dual loyalties. I think it's very irresponsible to accuse Jews, especially in the government, of dual loyalties. You're accusing them of treason, and that is inappropriate, and that's beyond the line. It's just crap. I mean, Jewish neoconservatives is what you said, of plumping for war with Iran. So Jewish neocons. So why is it the Jewish neoconservatives who are singled out? That's what I want to know. All I ask, very simply, is don't call the people who disagree with you traitors. Why is it so hard?
Did you just listen to this shit?
Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you for coming.
By no means, however, are all neoconservatives Jewish. That the very large majority of Jews in this country are neither neoconservative nor Republican, a source of great frustration to neoconservatives.
Explain what you're concerned about.
Look, sometimes the word neoconservative is used when what they really would like to say is Jew.
They being?
People who use that kind of language. And as a Jew, I find it offensive.
They do not represent a majority of the American Jewish community.
But you think it's legitimate to talk about the pro-Israeli politics of some of the neoconservatives?
Neoconservatives are not necessarily Israel firsters. They believe that both the U.S. and Israel are morally exceptional.
I would just make the obvious point that Kagan, Kraut, and I, and millions of hawks supported a bunch of interventions that had nothing much to do with the interests of Israel one way or the other. And I think we were hawkish on China, as CJ said. We were just generally hawkish, I think. And it wasn't a matter of watching out for Israel's interests. But I also think the U.S., Israel is a strong ally, and the U.S. should, where possible, help Israel defend itself and not be cavalier about Israel's interests in a dangerous part of the world.
And in the neoconservative view, the interests and values of the two countries are largely congruent, if not identical. As Bill Bennett once put it, somewhat mystically, America's fate and Israel's fate are one and the same.
There is no doubt that PNAC and the neocons largely shared Israel's vision of the Middle East. PNAC signatories and American Enterprise Institute scholars like Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith, even wrote a paper titled Clean Break, Securing the Realm for the incoming Israeli Netanyahu administration in 1996.
It called for a clean break with the peace process, rolling back Syria and removing Saddam Hussein from power, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right.
Back to that memo that you, Doug Feith, and others wrote about in 1996 for the incoming Netanyahu administration at the time, because so much goes back to that original document being the cornerstone of a neocon foreign policy.
It was the product of a study group. I never met with the study group. My name was on this because I had signed up for the study group. So I didn't approve it, I didn't read it. Having said that, I don't see any reason to disagree with its main points.
To Dr. Fukuyama, who had a kind of contretemps about this with Mr. Krauthammer, and then subsequently dropped it in his book, and I always wondered why.
Frank? Well, just on this question of Israel, I think that, first of all, I think that Israel is important to many neoconservatives. The problem is not divided loyalties or putting Israel's interest ahead of the United States.
A signatory of many PNAC letters and considered a core influential member of PNAC, Francis Fukuyama, suggested that part of the reason he doesn't subscribe to a neoconservative point of view anymore is because too much of the neocon ideology is influenced by what he calls the hardline Israeli right view,
what I said in my argument with Krauthammer is the problem is that many neoconservatives have adopted the point of view, the strategic prism of many hardliners on the Israeli right, including their interpretation of Arab motives and behavior, this idea that the Arabs don't understand any principles of legitimacy, it's only force that they respect, this sort of thing, which then dictates a whole way of dealing with that region as a whole. And I just said that was a big mistake. And I think that, that continues to be a problem. I mean, Krauthammer said that's anti-Semitism, but I just don't believe that that's really what was motivating me.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me hard to understand how we now neoconservatives have contempt for the Arabs and think they only believe in force and are ludicrously utopian about the possibility of building an Arab democracy in Iraq, but maybe those can go together. Can they? Is that what you think?
Well, that's a big, that was a big
but
contradiction.
We're just totally,
that was a big contradiction, it seems to me, in the position.
Maybe it's a big contradiction in the understanding of the position, and maybe one shouldn't impute views generally that in such a, but anyway, it's not, I just don't think it's empirically true what Frank says, that many neoconservatives were very much influenced by Israeli hardline views on the rest of the Middle East.
Maybe Fukuyama heard Don Kagan on the radio the day after 9/11 saying that the Arabs respect us the most when we are strong.
It's only force that they respect.
We are at our worst, and the Arabs are angriest at us and treat us the worst when they perceive us as being weak, lacking in will, and unable or unwilling to act. As soon as we do act strongly, do you remember what the view of the Arab world was to us right after the Gulf War? We were at the strongest situation we've ever been in.
I'm not even sure. I don't even know that many Israeli hardliners, I don't think very well, but...
In the same radio broadcast, Don Kagan and his son Fred suggested we invade Palestinian territories with U.S. ground troops.
We may not know who has conducted this particular attack. I think we already know there are a large number of terrorist organizations that have identified themselves with this, not in the sense that they did it, but that in the sense that they approve of it. We know that they have extensive bases in Palestine and Palestinian area. We have to take the war to these people. I think we should hit them immediately.
How?
Reason to wait. How?
Air power?
No, I would prefer to see ground forces go into Palestine and hunt out Hezbollah. I would like to see Delta Force raids. I would like to see the full panoply of covert operations. But I would also like to see American ground forces deployed into Palestine to restore peace in that area.
One key place is certainly the Palestinian Authority. These guys are at the center of all sorts of terrorist organizations that we've seen.
Well, now, what does that mean, again, in terms of
it means
military
military force? Absolutely.
On the day of 9/11, clips were played on CNN, Fox News, and NBC of Palestinians allegedly dancing in the streets, celebrating the 9/11 attacks.
However, while some Palestinians were taking to the streets in apparent celebration, one youth was quoted as saying, as he received sweets handed around in celebration, "This is a sweet from Osama bin Laden," he said.
Throwing candy, distributing candy to passers-by. The U.S. government obviously has become...
They're celebrating. Wreck their lives. For once, allow us... Whether you need Israel to do it or the United States to do it, I don't care which.
To me, that alone is a reason to bomb them.
Yet there was no context offered for how or why this footage was recorded, or even why it was aired in the middle of a national emergency, while thousands of New Yorkers were still struggling to find out if their loved ones were alive or dead.
Jumping up and down, celebrating. 5-year-olds. Those 5-year-olds will grow up to attack our children.
They're showing it right now.
Kill them.
And for 4 hours before bin Laden was blamed on television, the attacks themselves were blamed on the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
A Palestinian group has claimed responsibility for the plane crashes into the World Trade Center. This is a group called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
One Palestinian organization is claiming that the responsibility identified as the Palestinian group, the DFLP.
There has been a claim of responsibility, according to the Reuters news agency, from something called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Don and Fred probably picked up on this, and they understood that reality didn't matter. It was perception of reality that was more important.
How would the American people respond to the kind of war you are advocating?
Enthusiastically.
Enthusiastically, you
I
said.
believe that they would. There's every evidence that the American people are right now very enthusiastic for attacking the sorts of people who are capable of even thinking about doing these kinds of acts.
Palestinian organizations has been involved in violence before. It is the first organization to claim responsibility for this.
Arab and Muslim communities in the U.S. and Canada are feeling a growing backlash over the New York and Washington terrorist attacks.
Look at NBC. Kill them for celebrating. Kill them.
In their schools at 5
Look,
years
there
old,
they
they're
are.
being
Here
indoctrinated.
they are. They're all celebrating in the streets. The Palestinians are celebrating in the streets, ladies and gentlemen. They're putting up the victory sign. Children are cheering. Today, drop the nuclear bomb on them.
There's no reason for those people.
Give them nuclear warfare. It's the only thing they understand. Like the bastard children they are.
Palestinians were taking to the streets in apparent celebration.
Don and Fred knew full well that Palestinians had absolutely nothing to do with the attacks, but they took advantage of the intense emotional climate to plant the seeds that Palestinians were actually our enemies.
I didn't say that we know exactly who conducted this attack. There are a few groups out there that are dedicated to conducting exactly this sort of attack, and I said that we should attack those groups regardless of whether we know exactly which one specifically conducted this.
And the groups that...
In the most violent incident, the windows of a mosque were shot out in Texas. And in Colorado, some men allegedly threatened to burn down another place of worship.
So again, it's worth asking, was it Trump who was to blame for inflaming racism, bigotry, and Islamophobia in the United States?
And I saw people, and I saw them on television, and I read about it on the internet, celebrating as the World Trade Center was coming down, killing thousands of people.
Or was Trump merely carrying the torch that the neocons had lit and kept aflame during the time when the war on terror narrative was still useful for them? A flame of America's worst traits personified: narcissism, authoritarianism, and xenophobia.
I think the question's really contemptible.
It seemed that Trump's brash rhetoric was beating neocons at their own game, but at the same time allowed the neocons to attempt yet another adaptation. When PNAC closed down and reopened under the name the Foreign Policy Initiative, critics rightfully described the move as a sort of neocon rebranding. If 2008 was the era of the neoconservative 2.0, 2016 seemed to be the era of the neocon 3.0.
People say that Americans don't like to fight. Every American has always loved to fight. And we hate losers. We despise and we have contempt of losers. We dread losing. We have great military power. And we love to fight. And so we will fight this war, and we will fight it well, and we will fight it enthusiastically. The important thing is to win. Then we can worry about all the jots and tittles of legal principles and so forth, because if you lose, there will be no discussion of these things whatsoever.
This week on Book Notes, our guest is Irving Kristol, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He joins us to discuss his recent book, Neoconservatism, the autobiography of an idea.
Irving Kristol, at one point in one of the essays, you admit to working for the CIA.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Oh, back in the 1950s, I was in London co-editing Encounter magazine with Stephen Spender. There were rumors that there was some government money behind it, but I guess it was in the mid-60s or thereabouts that it was revealed that, in fact, we thought we were being subsidized by an American foundation called the Farfield Foundation. And in fact, that was a front for the CIA, and it was CIA money.
How'd you find out?
It was made public in the press. I don't know how they found out. Somebody leaked, obviously. But I didn't inquire, and I didn't care, really.
What was your reaction at the time?
I was annoyed. I didn't want to work for the CIA.
Why would they want to fund the Encounter magazine?
That's why the question occurred to me that just occurred to you. Why on earth would they want to fund a magazine that Stephen Spender and I were editing, and whose general political outlook was liberal, not at all conservative?
Why the CIA would have funded it?
But Encounter was written from a liberal point of view, so people would really fall for it. And you could say all kinds of things from a liberal point of view, which still winds up supporting U.S. foreign policy to a great extent. That's the beauty of it, isn't it?
But it turned out, in fact, there was a liberal group within the CIA that thought it very important to have an intellectual magazine in Europe and indeed worldwide. They decided to support the magazine, and once they started supporting it, it was a very successful magazine. They became very proud of it and didn't let it go until they had to.
The man often called the father of neoconservatism has died. Irving Kristol was an author and columnist and magazine editor who described himself as an ex-liberal who'd been mugged by reality.
Neoconservatism. When was the first time you ever heard that word uttered?
It must have been sometime in the mid-1970s. It was not my term. I did not invent it. I believe it was invented by someone who was criticizing me. And I thought that that was a term of opprobrium. I decided that it was a pretty good description of, in fact, what I was thinking and feeling, so I ran with it.
What does it mean?
What it means is that it refers to a constellation of opinions and views that is not traditionally conservative, but is conservative, and is certainly not liberal. And since I and others who have been called neoconservatives moved from being liberals to being a kind of conservative, then neoconservatism seemed like a pretty good term.
How would you assess your son's position at this point with that publication? How does that relate to the discussion going on in town?
Well, my son's magazine is going to be a conservative magazine, independent conservative, and whether it could be called neoconservative by now almost doesn't matter. But ideas do matter, and my son, I guess, learned that in our household, since both his mother and father believed that. We have always believed that. That we learned from the left, by the way. I mean, the left has always understood that ideas matter.
The Presidential Medal of Freedom is the highest civil honor our nation can bestow, and we award it today to 12 outstanding individuals. Bill Cosby is helping to create a truly united America. As a gifted comedian, Irving Kristol is a wide-ranging thinker whose writings have helped transform America's political landscape.
Since, if you look at the Russian Revolution, it was created by a small handful of people with ideas.
As young men, he and his fellow student radicals in City College's Alcove No. 1 devoted themselves to solving the ultimate problems of the human race. And in thinking them through, he has vastly enlarged the conservative vision.
What's a neo-Marxist?
There's a Marxist who never accepted the full doctrine of Marxism and who had some severe doubts about some of the important doctrines of Marxism, as I always did from the beginning.
What's a neo, is it Trotskyite or Trotskyist?
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as a neo-Marxist.
Ever since I can remember, I've been a neo-something. A neo-Marxist, a neo-Trotskyist, a neo-liberal, a neo-conservative. In religion, always neo-Orthodox, even while I was a neo-Trotskyist and a neo-Marxist.
I did not want ever to be a Stalinist. I was always critical of Stalinist Russia. On the other hand, I found myself, when I was a young socialist, more and more critical of the teachings of Leon Trotsky, more and more skeptical of them. So I was a neo.
I'm going to end up a neo. Just neo, that's all. Neo-nothing.
His son, Bill Kristol, also a well-known conservative editor and writer, said his father died of complications from lung cancer. Irving Kristol was 89 years old.
You more than once referred to the ideas matter. And I guess that's what I'm getting at is, how do ideas move in the society? Society today, where's the influence? Where do you see the power of ideas coming from today?
Well, they clearly are not coming from liberalism.
Where did you meet Bob Kagan?
I met Bob Kagan in George Shultz's State Department. He was George Shultz's speechwriter, and I was a freshly minted baby diplomat.
By the way, I admire you very much, Ambassador. I don't admire your choice of spouses, but that is another
we had some friends in common, and we ended up at one of those nerdy, wonky lectures in the basement of the State Department, and sort of were interested in each other, and it went from there.
This week on Book Notes, our guest is Donald Kagan.
How long have you been at Yale?
This is my 26th year.
Don Kagan, he's the war guy. So you're a great professor, distinguished ancient historian, yet in Washington you're known as the war guy.
In the introduction, you have a dedication for Bob and Fred.
Yes.
And then you write a little bit about them. Mm-hmm. Who are they?
Bob and Fred are my two sons. Bob is the older, and he is a very interesting fellow who went into the government, and he put in a batch of years working mostly in the State Department. And
is it a political job?
A political job, yes.
For which president?
For President Reagan. Now he's decided that he, of all things, he wants to be a historian.
And finally, my family.
Please welcome Robert Kagan. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Where are they all? There they are. My brother and sister-in-law, Fred and Kim Kagan.
So your father is at Yale teaching. Right. Your brother is over in Belgium. Right. And who is his wife?
Victoria Newland.
What's this mean to you?
Oh, that is, of course, my husband, Fred Kagan, and he was introducing the members of his family and mine, the Kagan side. It is, of course, an interesting family also to be a part of.
David, by age 10, could tell a vintage Bordeaux from a Barolo in a blind taste test. That was not my fault. Blame their father, please.
So he got the taste of what it is to be a historian.
I'm proud to be my father's son. And as Groucho Marx once said, he's ashamed to be my father. That's a paraphrase.
Doing American history to try to get to be a professional historian.
American here in town.
Here in town.
Man, I am so happy that you're on this show because you're a neocon, right?
I guess that's what they tell me.
Yeah. And that's what they told me about you too.
Okay.
And I miss you guys.
Okay.
Because back in the early 2000s during the Bush administration, you guys were like the Cabbage Patch Kids, the Tickle Me Elmo. Everyone had to have a neocon. It's like talking to a collector's item. Now,
Thank you.
He has taught me so very much that I would never have known otherwise, because as a practitioner in the world of international relations, foreign affairs, he has brought the real world home to me and taught me an amazing amount, and I wanted to express my gratitude for that.
You've given me an opening, Senator. I neglected to thank my fabulous family, my parents, and my the two handsome gentlemen in the middle there, my husband and my son David, for coming today.
Give us an example of something he taught you.
Well, one of the things that he's explained to me about modern events is that there is the closest possible interrelationship between foreign policy, domestic politics, and finally, in the functioning of the media.
Ideas do matter.
That there's a three-way interrelationship. They affect each other enormously every single day. And that if you don't always ask the question, how does one affect the other? How is one derived from the other? You're missing a very critical element of what's happening. And now, mind you, I'd always known this in a general way, but in the detail that he was able to show it to me.
One of the things I think neoconservatism has contributed to contemporary conservatism is a strong belief, a strong acknowledgement that ideas do matter.
Neoconservatism is more of a worldview than a coherent political ideology. That worldview has been shaped by rather traumatic historic events, most notably the Nazi Holocaust.
This whole Kagan entourage that we have here in this, where did you all get your interest in this?
Well, I assume we had to have got it from my father, ultimately. Well, that's great. You live with a man for all those years, and you never stop living under his shadow, but that's okay.
Where did he get it?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe it's because when he was a kid, World War II was the big news.
For neocons, a new Hitler is always just around the corner, and we must be in a permanent state of mobilization to confront him.
I think it is somewhat analogous to the 30s now, but of course, friends of mine on the left say, oh, there you go, quoting Churchill again, it's not the 30s. The more relevant lesson is Vietnam. Iraq War, if you want to be really contemporary. And there we overreached. We got involved in something we didn't have to get involved in.
I mean, people, you do hear people saying that all the time, and every day they sound more and more foolish.
You earlier talk about your son Bob, also your son Fred.
Yes, I don't want to slight Fred.
Yeah, he had a different impact on you. For what reason?
Well, the United States finds itself in a very unusual situation with, I think, spectacularly unusual opportunities.
The Soviet Union no longer posed the threat it once did. With this in mind, the historians Donald and Frederick Kagan have given us a wake-up call. They warn us that we are entering one of the most challenging periods in our nation's history. And unless our national security policies are altered, the peace and safety we have known since the end of the Cold War will disappear.
Was it Thomas Donnelly who actually came up with the phrase, "a new Pearl Harbor," in rebuilding America's defenses?
I'm the guy who wrote that passage.
Thomas Donnelly was a founding member of the Project for the New American Century.
It turned out that Don Kagan actually oversaw the document's publication. So could it be that the most World War II obsessed neocon of them all, Don Kagan, was actually behind the phrase?
Before Pearl Harbor, a lot of Americans thought it was a blast from the blue.
There seems to be some debate as to where the phrase "a new Pearl Harbor" actually comes from, or what its significance actually is. Journalist Matt Taibbi suggests that the left experienced derangement when it honed in on this aspect of rebuilding America's defenses as being something more than an eerie and timely prediction of 9/11. He claims that the phrase itself is actually innocuous when put into context, since the rebuilding or transformative change would take decades.
Donald Kagan and his son Frederick present a critique of military readiness in their book, While America Sleeps, Self-Delusion, Military Weakness, and the Threat to Peace Today.
What Matt didn't mention is that Don Kagan in his writings broaches the subject of an impending new Pearl Harbor scenario numerous times.
And I would simply add, I'm very confident that some other terrible thing that we never dreamed of is likely to happen someplace down the road.
While Matt is responding to a more extreme claim that the players in PNAC were also somehow behind 9/11.
Donnelly is often accosted at events by conspiracy buffs who accuse his former think tank of orchestrating the 9/11 attacks.
Could it have been another more elusive possibility that Matt didn't consider in his book?
So obviously the answer is no.
Don and Fred weren't naive when they went on the radio and said such inflammatory things.
Fred's a Russian historian, and one of his assistances to me was, first of all, that he can read Russian and I can't. So he was able to translate documents for me and get me at stuff I couldn't have gotten at otherwise.
Fred Kagan understood Soviet military history and doctrine.
This may seem abstruse and weird, but I was actually surprised to discover the importance of doctrine.
Fred read Russian and had a thorough understanding of not just Russian military doctrine, but Russian psyops and information war.
So these things all have technical meaning, and when they come down from the top and they get translated to the bottom, everybody's able to pick it up very quickly.
It's hard to discount the possibility that some of these neocons eagerly wanted a new Pearl Harbor to materialize.
I'm sure in 3-4 days, everybody, in spite of what happened in New York and Washington, everybody will go back to where we were before and think, okay, that was a one-shot, that's over. But what would have happened if instead of just having a lot of jet fuel on those planes, they had had anthrax facility? Have any clue what that would have been? Now, those are the options that are before us. People are capable of doing that. Our question is, how can we stop them from being able to do that? There is no way.
In 1999, Russia experienced its own 9/11.
In the fall of 1999, this
Bombs obliterated 4 apartment buildings in Moscow and other cities. This was Russia's 9/11.
Neocons Richard Pearl and David Frum wrote about Russia being behind the attacks in their book, claiming that they were an inside job.
The Russian officials said that there was a Chechen trail in the apartment bombings.
And that Islamic terrorists weren't bombing apartment buildings in Russia, that it was actually Putin's FSB.
But the broader conclusion that security services could have killed their own people.
What Matt Taibbi was characterizing as conspiratorial accusations against the neocons, the neocons themselves were regularly making similar accusations about Russia and Putin.
Vladimir Putin is a person who's killed, he's jailed and murdered journalists, political opponents. He bombed an apartment building as a pretext to attack the Chechens.
But whatever did happen to our anthrax attacks? Was it Middle Eastern terrorists like our government and media led us to believe at such a sensitive time? Or like Russia's Chechen scapegoats for the apartment building bombings? Was there something more sinister at play?
Federal investigators say the 2001 anthrax attacks case has been solved, even though the suspect committed suicide before he could be arrested.
Eventually, the attacks were pinned on what the FBI described as a super patriot, who happened to have top clearance at a U.S. bioweapons lab in Maryland. A Caucasian male named Bruce Ivins, even though the hard evidence against him was non-existent.
And although the FBI never produced any physical evidence tying that individual specifically to the attacks, they closed the case.
Would these questions, too, be what Matt Taibbi described as a derangement of the left?
Why was the Bush administration and press people on Cipro before the attacks even happened?
They were?
Yeah.
The Bush administration was actually already on Cipro, the antidote to anthrax infection, on the evening of 9/11. It didn't pass the warning on to the public.
Lawsuit regarding Vice President Cheney's staff receiving anthrax shots before the October outbreak.
Well, this is another good example of how certain people consider themselves to be above the rest of us. On September 11th, I think it'll come as a shock to a lot of people, but it's been reported by the New York Times and other major news organizations and confirmed by the White House. The President's office and Vice President's office went on Cipro, the antibiotic that was used to combat anthrax.
In fact, Bush himself announced in his radio address not to panic and tried to dissuade the public away from taking antibiotics.
There's no precedent for this type of biological attack. Remember, doctors warn that you can put your health at risk by taking antibiotics when you don't need them. So use antibiotics only after consulting a healthcare professional.
The White House went on Cipro. It must have known that either an attack was underway or was imminent. Yet other individuals, such as the postal workers, weren't given antibiotics for several weeks.
If the United States were willing to take the lead, were skillful in doing it, but they are always reluctant to pay the price.
5 people, including Brentwood postal workers, ended up dying from the attacks, who were not privileged enough to be warned to take precautions.
We have a gentleman who worked at the Brentwood mail handling facility here in Washington, D.C. with a clinical presentation suspicious for anthrax. Those tests have come back. That is now confirmed.
And to see that people are getting the treatment they need when they need that treatment, irrespective of where they are, where they come from, what they look like, or where they work. It's very, very important.
The Bush administration itself never actually went on record and said Saddam was behind 9/11 or the anthrax attacks. They only alluded to it.
For the second time today, we have a chance to talk to the former CIA Director James Woolsey.
Saddam has gone out of his way to make common cause with some of these fundamentalist terrorist groups, and one possible candidate is the government of Iraq.
That has not been introduced by anyone.
Whenever I hear people talk about bringing the terrorists to justice, I wince a little bit, because some may be able to be brought to justice, but if Saddam Hussein was behind all this, you're not going to bring him to justice.
It was later revealed that Paul Wolfowitz, the main neoconservative hawk inside the Bush administration, gave former CIA Director James Woolsey a special assignment to find a connection between Saddam Hussein and the anthrax mailings. Wolfowitz, Woolsey, Kagan, and Crystal all shared a history together, And it wasn't based on service in government. They shared an ideological vision in which they all collaborated on back in the 1990s at the Project for the New American Century.
There is a strong possibility Iraq has been involved in one way or another. We are not to be held to some sort of lawyerly standards of proof here. We're going to have to make judgments, hard judgments, and we can't get trapped in legal niceties.
It seemed like James Woolsey's real assignment was to go onto the press and plant the seeds on the day of 9/11 that Iraq was responsible. But was he doing this on behalf of the administration?
But you have mentioned in this conversation alone 3 times, and I think you mentioned it yesterday, Iraq. Why do you keep bringing up Iraq? I want you to explain it, because every time you say something on television these days, people are either sometimes inclined to believe it immediately.
It would be a clever way to compartmentalize some of the more extreme propaganda that the public wouldn't be able to directly tie to the administration.
Tell me generically speaking, or tell us generically speaking, what's the CIA doing at the moment? Right? What's it doing today? It's
Hello, this is a free call from an inmate at Warren County Regional Jail. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
But there was even more troubling aspects to the anthrax attacks, like the claims of former drone intelligence analyst Matt DeHart.
If you know my background and what I did in the Guard was with drones. I was an all-source intelligence analyst.
Matt says he was given thousands of pages of internal government documents by an FBI whistleblower.
And by late 2009, someone had uploaded a file to the shell, which is a server, which I operated the front end of.
Showing that somehow the CIA itself was behind the 2001 anthrax attacks.
It had a text intro by an individual claiming to be a special agent from the FBI. He was describing how the included documents pointed to the CIA involvement in the Amerithrax case. So you had an index, a file index, which I skimmed through, had PDFs, PowerPoint files. The PDFs included scanned handwritten notes. Some of them seemed to be JWICS sourced, which JWICS is a classified network that U.S. agencies use. It all led me to believe that this was real information. I mean, it's not stuff you could have faked. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There was Nuclear Regulatory Commission paperwork tracking a radioactive cobalt source. And from the handwritten notes, they thought that source was used to degrade or render inert weaponized anthrax.
The next attack will not be of the same nature as this one. It will be entirely different.
What is the most dangerous route to think about now?
Well, I think we have to worry about the use of biological and chemical weapons.
Do you understand why neoconservatives scare the hell out of a lot of people? Not just tyrants in the Middle East, but ordinary people.
We know that Saddam Hussein hates the United States. We know he has anthrax. Can we afford to wait, not a few spores at a time in letters sent through the mail, but in a way that could kill tens of thousands of Americans, maybe even more, what we know he is capable of doing?
That maybe some wacko right-wing group is sending this anthrax around as a type of Reichstag fire in order to get this kind of a solution. I never put much credibility in that before, but after hearing you gentlemen today, I think there is probably something to it.
This does scare a lot of people, right?
I understand that.
Unfortunately, after becoming involved with Anonymous, he was arrested, and his thumb drives containing these documents is now property of the U.S. government.
Was this person suggesting that the White House was involved in this, or that it was somehow being done independently of, like, what I'm asking is how far up the chain of command was this person suggesting that it went?
He didn't make too many assertions in that regard as to how it was called for initially, but he did assert that the FBI investigation, which was following this NRC paperwork, that it be quashed, and that came from the Vice President himself.
Welcome back to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol. An honor to have with us today Vice President Dick Cheney.
Good to be here, Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And probably safe for that, it would have been for the next 13 and a half years. We still haven't had a big attack, successful attack here. So since that, sort of a post 9/11 world, you have quarrels with this administration, but do you feel that the country has sort of come to grips with the 21st century challenges we face? Do you think?
I'm really worried.
what would have happened if ISIS, the group in Pakistan, we've got a nation that has significant inventory of new radical Islamists that are part of the political scene, where President Obama released 5 of their leaders from Guantanamo. Look at that part of the world and think we can hide behind our ocean, everything's fine. That's crazy. You got to be a fool to believe isolation is part of the world, and if we're not actively involved there, some very bad things are going to happen. I think if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, it'll only be so we're in a very dangerous period. I think it's more threatening than the period before 9/11. Not nearly as bad as the next mass casualty attack against the United States, which, if and when it comes, will be something with far deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters.
I don't want to end on such a grim note, but you have hope. You have hope for the future.
Well, I do.
What actually gives you the most hope?
Last year, when I interviewed former Vice President Dick Cheney, I asked him who he thought would do better with international relations. You were leading polls at the time among Republican candidates, or Hillary Clinton, and he refused to give me an answer.
Peace doesn't keep itself, as I say in the book. I think it's very important to understand somebody, and the state that has to do it is the state that has the greatest interest in preserving the peace, has the power to do it, has to work at it. Somebody has to work hard at it. What does that mean? It needs to make sacrifices now in peacetime so that it will not have to make much greater sacrifices in a war should it come later on. The opportunity strikes me as being very, very great.
Lost opportunities to avert a horrible war.
We've talked to a lot of Republicans, and they of several minds. One is that the party must be saved, and they're prepared to lose the election to save the party.
Yeah, meaning let the whole thing burn down.
No, I mean, Hillary is the neocon's neocon. It's going to be fascinating that she will be more of a saber-rattler and more of a neocon than probably the Republican nominee. Is that not the case? I mean, there's hardly been a military engagement that Hillary hasn't been for in the past 20 years.
Smart. Were you smart about Iraq, endorsing the president's position on Iraq? Did you believe ever that Saddam Hussein, when you had to cast that vote to authorize the war in Iraq, did you ever believe that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons?
I did.
Who told you?
Well,
the question is Donald Trump right when he said they lied?
Well, I think that what Mike Hayden and others have said is that it was an intelligence failure. Now, I don't know.
No, but they never said they had nuclear weapons. How could it be a failure?
Well, they led some people to believe that.
Yeah, but not with evidence. But not with evidence. You didn't have evidence they had nuclear weapons, did you?
What we had was let me speak for myself.
You never had evidence of nuclear weapons?
No, but that was because the inspection program had not been completed. And where I stood, I believed George W. Bush.
Why did you trust W?
Well, I thought that using diplomacy, which is what it seemed to me he was offering, made a lot of sense.
Did he seem the diplomatic type, W?
I've said Iraq was a mistake. I've said that what I thought the strategy was, which was to let the inspectors finish. And that's why, I've said repeatedly it was a mistake for me to
Why was
give him that
Bernie
vote.
Sanders right and you were wrong?
We differed on the war in Iraq.
What do you think was in him that allowed him to see what you couldn't see?
Look, we did differ.
Back in 2002, when we both looked at the same evidence, one of us voted the right way and one of us didn't.
Well, Chris, I'm just telling you that that was the prevailing opinion. And look, I've said it was a mistake because...
No, and I want to know about the facts, but we have 100,000 people dead in Iraq because of that war that we started. We invaded. We did the war. We were the war. And then you went into Libya and you supported regime change.
That's a very different
But why do you keep wanting to do these things of regime change?
Secretary Clinton is too much into regime change.
I was very flattered when Henry Kissinger said I ran the State Department better than anybody had run it in a long time.
What's in your thinking that says the United States government has some right and duty to go to Middle Eastern countries and knock off their leadership?
Well,
And I think you were more aggressive when knocking off Bashir Assad, too.
Well, let me tell you what I believe, and then you people can make their own judgment. Libya was very different. You know, I think it's conflating the two does a disservice.
But the principal regime change, what do you make of it?
No, look.
Constantly trying to knock off their leaders.
No, that is just an overstatement that doesn't really reflect the situation.
Don't you support knocking off Assad, Bashir Assad?
If, you know, I think that given the bloodshed he has spilled, that would be a good outcome, but Americans aren't going to do it. That's not us doing it.
In Syria, government troops continue to make headway against Islamic State terrorists in the desert city of Palmyra.
خلال ساعات قليلة بعد ذلك نجحنا التسلل إلى العمق وسيطرنا على التلال المشرفي على تدمور.
Do you want to see the regime retake Palmyra? Or would you prefer that it stays in Daesh's hands?
That's truly a... look, Assad's brutal crackdown on his own people created the kind of vacuum, if you will, that has allowed a group like ISIL or Daesh to flourish.
You're not answering my question.
I know I'm not. I'm giving you a broader view.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
And there was never this, you know, there was never this no boots on the ground.
President Obama, early tomorrow morning in Germany, is expected to announce an additional 250 Special Operations Forces will be sent to Syria.
I don't know where this keeps coming from.
Well, yes.
There was there wasn't. There was
what?
We're not going to be involved in a large-scale combat mission on the ground. That is what the president has long said. We have three. Wait a minute. Wait.
The mantra from the president and everyone else in the administration has been no boots on the ground, and now
that is not true.
What?
It's just not true, man.
It is.
It's just not true.
It's true.
No, it's not.
I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria.
Well, I just flatly, absolutely disagree with you.
It was all options are on the table except boots on the ground. That was the.
I never said that. And
well, that was the whole line from the president on down. Anyway.
People like Bill Kristol, John Podhoretz, certainly Charles Krauthammer, Robert Kagan, very smart people who have neoconservative culture and views behind them. They're going to be interesting to watch now. I don't think they're comfortable at all with Trump, with his latest line about even-handed position on the Middle East.
Neocons like Kagan had already seen the writing on the wall, but now it was guaranteed that Trump would get the Republican nomination.
The voters chose another path.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Don't get nervous. Go ahead.
We are suspending our campaign.
While it is not God's plan that I be president in 2016 or maybe ever, and while today my campaign is suspended,
So they're going to look for a candidate now. This is fascinating because that candidate could very well be Hillary Clinton. And that's when you're going to see a real sea change. Looking for a ship to go to, and I think it's going to be Hillary Clinton.
That's been
That's been part of my mission.
In interviews with Politico, leading neocons said Trump would be a disaster for U.S. foreign policy and vowed never to support him. So deep is their revulsion that several even said they could vote for Hillary Clinton over Trump in November.
It seemed that Trump's rise had caused the implosion of the GOP, but it also seemed to be fracturing the neocon clique in Washington, D.C. Robert Kagan, Max Boot, Elliot Cohen, and other prominent neocons who jumped on the Stop Trump bandwagon had now openly endorsed Hillary Clinton for president in the general election. The odd man out was Bill Kristol.
What are you going to do? I'm not with Trump, but I'm not with her, so I'm looking for an independent candidate.
His name is Bill Kristol. From day one, this poor guy, all the guy wants to do is kill people and go to war and kill people.
No, I would like there to be an independent Republican candidate because I can't support Trump and I can't support Clinton.
If it comes down to it and it's Clinton versus Trump,
I'll write in someone, appropriate.
But you're never Trump. You're not voting for him.
No.
Bill Kristol, he's got some magazine, I don't even know what the hell it is, and he's saying, we're looking for another candidate. He's sweating, and we're looking for another candidate.
Hi, Allison.
How is your effort to find a third-party candidate going?
It's going fine. I mean, it's a tough thing to do. If it were easy, people would do it every 4 years. But there are a lot of serious people who think the country deserves a better choice than Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and they're considering it. And I think we'll know in a couple of weeks.
I actually feel sorry for him. He's been doing this for like 9 months. He can't find anybody. What a loser.
But what about the Texas not being able to be on the Texas ballot, the deadline having passed, other deadlines coming up?
People have some kind of weird interest in telling us how hard this is to do. Let us try to do it. I mean,
if you work at it, you stick with it, you can make a difference.
Now, if you guys want to say, oh, well, I mean, I'm sorry, the people have so far have said, no, it can't happen. That's great. Let's have a Trump. You guys would love a Trump-Clinton race. Fantastic news every day, right? Two really unattractive candidates fighting stupidly.
And by the way, I heard his magazine is doing so badly it's ready to fold, so don't bother with him, okay? What a loser.
Is it 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago? I've lost track of time. It's been such a wonderful, elevating, edifying experience to see Donald Trump here as the likely Republican nominee.
Excuse me.
Hillary, by almost any measure, was a neoconservative.
Too much to say.
Overtly pro-regime change, and was responsible for bringing Bob Kagan into the U.S. State Department. But if Hillary Clinton had such a cozy relationship with the Kagans as Secretary of State, if Hillary became president, where would the Kagans go? Victoria Nuland seemed poised to climb to the next available position.
Wow.
So, Philip, if Hillary does become president, do you think that it's likely that Victoria Nuland will be chosen as Secretary of State?
Well, I think it's quite likely. The advantage that Victoria Nuland has in terms of mobility in the national security apparatus is the fact that she's extremely acceptable both to Democrats and Republicans. She's worked in both administrations. For Dick Cheney, for example, in the White House.
So Robert Kagan, do you see him moving up somewhere else in a Hillary administration, or do you see him remaining an outsider?
I think he sees himself as he and Victoria, as she has Mr. Insider and he has Mr. Outsider. There's a big advantage to playing it that way. He can register opinions that she, as a government official, might be reluctant to enunciate, and as a result, he can push policies in directions that then she can pick up on as the insider, and it works very well for them. They've been playing this game for quite some time.
She's a U.S. diplomat, and she serves in the U.S. mission to NATO, which is in Brussels.
Does that help or hurt you in your work?
I'd say it both helps and hurts.
How?
So I said to him, you can write on anything but Europe this time. So
they have contacts both inside and outside. He benefits from the money that comes from military contractors.
It helps in the sense that I benefit from her enormous wisdom and insight into these matters. It hurts in the sense that I'm not allowed to use anything that she tells me in any way, and
she on the inside can implement the policies that make the military contractors happy.
I'm always very careful. I can never really write about the subject that she happens to be working on at the time. We have to keep a kind of firewall between us when we talk.
Kagan continued to shift the projected image of himself more and more to the left. Now Kagan was referring to Trump in the same way that the people Kagan hated referred to Bush in the early 2000s, as a fascist. Another attempt to distance himself from the neocon history of flirting with fascism.
But above all, we have a winning messianic vision, because we are a messianic country. And our message is, our messianic vision is the triumph of freedom everywhere in the world. And that is built into our national DNA. We can no more get out of that than we can get out of our love for our foods and our sports and our clothes.
While Gary Schmidt and Thomas Donnelly had resurrected Rebuilding America's Defenses for the right-wing think tank AEI, Robert Kagan and Eric Edelman had resurrected their own version, not for the Republicans or the neocons, but for liberal interventionists, just in time for the final stages of the presidential election. Now that Rubio and Cruz were gone, this paper clearly wasn't written for Trump. It was written directly for what could potentially be a Hillary Clinton presidency. The rebranding attempt was working. If the neocons could gain influence over a Democratic administration like they did under Bush, it would be their most successful rebranding effort yet.
Liberalism is a violation of other sovereignty because you're supposed to be encouraging people to have the right to vote, etc. So there was a tension in liberal internationalism, which I think is unreconcilable in a certain way. The United States has done its best to try to reconcile it.
I think the distinctions between neocon and liberal interventionists are almost evaporated.
The scary part was, it didn't take very many DC policymakers on the inside or outside, whether it be the Kagans, neocons, or even liberal interventionists, to escalate a foreign policy conflict to the point of no return.
That's why I do emphasize liberal world order does not necessarily mean international law, because international liberalism has got two elements to it which are in contradiction to each other, it seems to me. But it's not a simple sort of follow the law and everything is right. It seems to me true realism would be to understand in as sort of basically the sort of tragic dilemma of being a great power.
All right, go back to the Kagan family.
The Kagan family business of war making, Fred, Kim, Don, Robert.
So, they have all the bases covered. And the way this thing works is interesting to watch. The ones who are the outsiders, the ones who are outside the government, particularly Kimberly, for example, are able to promote policies that are favorable to the military-industrial complex.
And you're all there on a holiday around the table. When is it they say, there Kim goes again? Or when did they say, there goes Fred off on that tangent again? Are there tangents that all of the Kagan family have around that table?
So they promote these policies, and once these policies reach a level where they're intellectually acceptable, because that's what their job is. So they provide the intellectual underpinning of the process.
When your family's all together, do you all argue about this kind of stuff?
We argue mostly about Yankees baseball and 1940s movies. But of course, we're all interested in U.S. foreign relations, but we all think about the problems differently. We all agree that the United States needs to take an active role in foreign policy.
And then once the stuff gets out, it's picked up by people like Victoria, who are in the government. And this then is a first step, essentially, to turn this stuff into policy, to increase defense budgets.
And that war right now is more prominent an element in our lives in this world than it has been since World War II, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And so...
Again, a family of teachers, historians, and people interested in strategy. And so it was and has been a very wonderful time.
The Kagans and other neocons were fond of wartime presidents like Truman, Reagan, and Kennedy, but for some reason they didn't seem too fond of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Maybe this was because Eisenhower, in his very last speech, was able to admit a scary truth about what drove American foreign policy. Eisenhower didn't focus on the idea that it was America's duty to maintain the world order after World War II.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry.
Instead, he chose to warn us about the very essence of what the Kagan family business was.
There is war right now. There's every reason to think it will spread. Everything I see, but also any study of the past, suggests that it will not stop being that way until something big happens to stop it.
We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Washington, D.C. think tank circuit that was being largely funded by defense corporations was the so-called military-industrial complex that Eisenhower was warning us about.
But let's pay our attention chiefly to the world of the modern world, knows that war is perpetual so far.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
If we just let our own vision of the world go forth and we embrace it entirely and we don't try to be clever, it just wage a total war against these tyrants, I think we'll do very well, and our children will sing great songs about us years from now.
Thank you, Michael.
Really weird sense of humor.
So that's, we do have family squabbles and family fun, but as I told you, sometimes they're more about the fun stuff that all families talk about, rather than some of these political issues that we all deal with, in part because family time can be a wonderful way of relaxing and not thinking about the things we do at work.
Even though some neocons chose not to remember inflammatory rhetoric that they put into the ether, luckily, their statements were now part of the historical record and would serve as a warning sign to future generations about how actually evil and clever the people were whose job it was to keep the state of perpetual war moving and to maintain the world order.
In fact, around here we'd say you're so short you can shower in the sink. I really am, and I'm not entirely certain why I'm here.
You heard at the debate Saturday, Donald Trump accused President Bush and his team of purposely lying the country into war. Your response?
He sounds like a liberal Democrat to me, Brett.
Because, it seems like all you have to do is say the Iraq War, and that means, well, you don't go to war because that war was a failure and was a mistake, and the only thing that was wrong was that we got involved in it. Well, the fact of the matter is, we succeeded in the Iraq War. There was, nobody was getting shot and nobody was getting killed, and
pleased you could take time from your duties on Fox News to being with us today. Dr. Fred Kagan, that's a joke. Dr. Fred Kagan, director.
It's an honor to be joined now by Governor Lincoln Chafee for a conversation about challenges to U.S. national security.
Thank you to FPI for inviting me here. Surprise invitation, but happy to accept.
You know, it struck me that the Coburns, Alexander, Patrick, and Andrew, have a family not unlike yours.
Slightly
Donald,
on a different
Fred,
side.
Exactly. And I want to just extend an invitation to you and the Coburns so we can get all 6 of you together at some point to talk about the world. We have plenty of time to do that.
That sounds delightful.
I have one of the best lives I can think of. I have a job I love and I feel committed to. I have a terrific family and I have a wonderful intellectual partner. So I just want to be a good mom, and I want to be a good representative of our great country, and I want to make NATO as strong an organization for all of us as it can be.
I know when the world will end, in approximately 4.5 billion years. As far as I remember, the sun's life cycle is around 7 billion years, which means now we're right in the middle. So it will all be over in another 4 billion years. The reactor will simply die out. Now, that will be the end of the world as we know it. But I'm not afraid. It's inevitable.
Чего бояться, если это неизбежно?
Spent the whole day together. He was showing me all facets of his character. So we went to the Art Institute. He showed his cultural side, and then we took a nice long walk.
Kind of romantic.
Michigan Avenue. And did we go to the movie first?
I had thought that perhaps as my new profession, rather than starting the Institute for the Study of War, I could actually stand in for A-Rod in the postseason, since in fact my contract doesn't cost as much as his, and I probably hit about as well as he does in the postseason.
So about this time you're driving him crazy because you're talking about A-Rod.
Exactly.
If I had to do it over and study something that I didn't study enough before I got into government, it would be social psychology and cognitive psychology, and trying to understand a little bit better how those processes work.
How did you feel about being called the architect of the war?
Well, I mean, there's hardly a point in denying it. It isn't true, of course. But... And as far as the planning is concerned, I had nothing whatever to do with that. Nothing.
I'm a student of Machiavelli. I wrote a book on Machiavelli. And I know the struggle against evil is going to go on forever.
Could you give me a mic check, please?
9/11 was a huge wake-up call, reality impinged, and the president decided, in my view correctly, that to simply stand back and let things develop around the world was a recipe for more 9/11s, was a recipe for death and for tyranny prevailing, and that we had to be active in the world.